I'm Eric Rasmussen.
Who organized this whole thing.
It's been so much fun, and it's been such a great thing to do. We are here today to celebrate the unaccountable retirement of Richard Strier, his life in the academy, and with literally 4 generations of Richard's PhD students here. I don't know of a similar symposium that I'm aware of. So I'm just so pleased. We're starting out with the older generation because we tend to sundown. Just if you're wondering, the order of events is by the date in which people receive their PhDs. Basically, we've asked everyone to just give a brief talk about their work, Richard's influence on their work, and sort of maybe 10-15 minutes for everyone. I haven't told the presenters this, but what we've also just planned is to have Richard give a little response. And then I think it would be a good idea, since we've got such a convivial crowd, that if people have a question or two for individual presenters, we can do that. But we do have quite a number of people to get through, so we will try to move as expeditiously as possible. Our first speaker is Jeffrey Stern. Jeffrey is a psychoanalyst who is at the Chicago Institute for Psychoanalysis, as well as Wuhan University in Wuhan, China. Jeffrey.
So I'm really quite thrilled to be here, and thrilled to be speaking while I'm still alert and awake, before I've started to nod. Anyway, so the title of my talk is How Richard Taught Me to Be a Psychoanalyst. I couldn't help but notice that I am speaking first because I am Richard's first PhD, and that I am evidently the only one trained by Richard who isn't an English professor. This reminds me of my father's making pancakes for me and my brother Todd on Sundays when we were small. He'd always burn the first one and have to throw it away. If I'm such a pancake, I don't think Richard can be blamed for it. I wasn't originally his student. I was working on Shakespeare's romances, and David was directing my dissertation. Edward Wasiolik, who was the chairman of the Slavic department, was the only card-carrying psychoanalytic critic in the division at the time, so he was my second reader. Third readers were optional but not required. I'd spent what was going on a third of my life at the time in graduate school, and I wanted to get out. Richard, then an enfant terrible, was famously impossible to please, and Bevington and Wasiolik were comparatively easy. How ridiculous would it be, I thought, to be stuck in graduate school till the last syllable of recorded time, trying to please the lowly, if clearly bound for greatness, assistant Professor Stryer, when 2 famous chaired professors were ready to sign my release. There was more. Richard and I were buddies. We might have met at an English department sherry hour, but our relationship was based almost entirely on tennis. We played nearly every day of the summer at the Quadrangle Club, and because we were pretty evenly matched, it was always interesting and fun. But the most fun was hanging out. We'd sit together, waiting for our court to open, sit together chilling out after we played, and usually have dinner at the Agora on 57th. Richard was the world's best talker and the world's best listener, and a world-class free associator. We talked about tennis, Jimmy Connors, why wasn't he smarter, why couldn't he serve, McEnroe, Ford, Boris Becker. We ate Wimbledon breakfasts of lox and bagels when the finals were on in London at Richard's apartment. We talked about the English department, about famous professors giving lectures, and famous poets who were famous lectures, about women, about friends, parents, my brothers, Stephen Greenblatt, Stanley Fish, Edward Said, Richard's friends and relations, a multitude even then to rival those of Rabbit and Winnie the Pooh. I was afraid that if Richard didn't like my work, I might lose the best friend I'd ever had or was ever likely to have. But Richard's intellect was, as they say, simply irresistible. Much as I wanted to be done, I wanted my project to be good, and Richard was already the best reader of Shakespeare I'd ever seen. So I asked him if he'd join my committee. He wondered why it had taken me so long, but I was right. He was all but impossible to please. But as I hoped, he also taught me how to argue and how to write. Well and good, you might be thinking, but what has this to do with Richard teaching me psychoanalysis? Of course, Richard never thought he was teaching me psychoanalysis, but the intensity of his listening was probably the best lesson in psychoanalytic technique I ever had. Richard's attention is penetrating, empathic, thoughtful, curious, argumentative, and kind. He always finds ways of helping you discover the next thing you need to say, especially when you have no idea what this might be. Excellent things in psychoanalysts. When I knew nothing about psychoanalysis, I imagined that literature would be the best possible training for it. I know a lot about it now, and I still think so. Literary critics read and try to make sense of stories. Psychoanalysts do pretty much the same thing, although for us there is another turn of the screw. We participate in the experience that generates many of our patients' stories, so we have to try to make sense of things at the same time that we are immersed in bringing them about. But the job of trying to understand the reliability of a narrator or the dynamics between characters or the historic and cultural surround that shapes all that happens and is said, all of this is pretty much the same. So in teaching me to read Shakespeare, Richard was teaching me to read what was going on with my patients. Unfortunately, but not surprisingly, psychoanalysts are at least as likely as literary critics to be blinded by the sources of their insight. For many years, I was part of a group of psychoanalytically minded graduate students and literary-minded psychoanalysts. I remember the shrinks smugly insisted that literary critics had no way to test their claims because texts couldn't talk back the way patients can. When a psychoanalytic interpretation is wrong, they would say, the patient lets us know. This sounds good, but it's almost entirely disingenuous. Because when a patient disagrees with a shrink, the shrink usually sees the disagreement not as a reason to rethink what he has said, but rather as resistance. Everything that Richard says about resistance structures in literature could be said about them in psychoanalysis. Analysts typically see their job as hammering away at their patient's resistance until they give in and see things the way the analyst does. They tend not to realize that patients who do give in often do so not because they eventually see the light, but because they need the analyst's approval and are willing to say anything to hold on to it. The braver ones, the ones who never stop resisting, are traditionally condemned to that circle of analytic hell known as the realm of the unanalyzable. Judged to be incapable of true self-knowledge, these unfortunates are told that a form of supportive psychotherapy is probably better suited to their fragile egos than the purer but more volatile elixir of psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis is full of resistant structures. Dreams, symptoms, slips, jokes, character itself are all sources of bafflement, confusion, variety, pleasure, and surprise if they are allowed to be. Perhaps if Richard's resistant structures were required reading at psychoanalytic institutes, patients and analysts alike would have way more fun, and more importantly, more people in pain would have less of it. I began as a dyed-in-the-wool Freudian. It was exciting to have a theory that seemed to explain everything under the sun. Of course, the theory had problems, and like the worst literary critics Richard writes about, I did my best not to think about them. But I couldn't entirely not think of them any more than you can get yourself to entirely not think about a crocodile. What about my gay friends? Well, they were all neurotic, of course, but so were all my straight friends. So, God knows, was I. But we were never thought neurotic because we were straight. Why then were they said to be neurotic because they were gay? We were taught that they were developmentally arrested, had failed to traverse the entire course of the Oedipus complex, so they were sicker than we who had indeed made it to the Oedipal finish line and then retreated. Or so the unsatisfying story went. I remember when I stopped being a Freudian, not an admirer of Freud, I've never not been that, but when I realized there were more things in heaven and earth than were dreamt of in Freud's psychology. I had a patient who was constantly distracted, depressed, and on the verge of flunking out of law school. She was chatty in a mindless, flight attendant-y sort of way, And although she seemed likable enough, all of our sessions felt programmatic and dead. One day in December, I came into the office in a bright new red sweater with white reindeer and mountains on it that I had bought at the Gap. She lit up when I opened the door to let her in. "I love your sweater," she enthused, to my surprise. "I had a reindeer sweater like that when I was little. My Nana knitted it for me right before she got sick and died. I never wanted to take it off." I was excited by Annie's enthusiasm and vivacity. It was the first time I felt a real sense of connection with her. "Penis envy," my supervisor said. "What?" I said. "Your sweater is a bright red penis. She imagines she had one when she was little and lost it. It's every girl's developmental fantasy. She needs to know that what is keeping her mired in depression is her unwillingness to accept her biological destiny." I told him I thought it would be very hard for me to say any of that to Annie. "Well, you have to," he insisted. I decided I didn't have to. I told Annie that I thought she was excited because the sweater made her think that I might be capable of genuine warmth. It was a sweater, for Pete's sake. And that we might share feelings that weren't superficial but important to her, like the life and death of her grandmother. As readers of Richard understand, you never abandon the surface for the depths. A sweater is always a sweater. What I said that day seemed to open a small door. Annie began to tell me what she had come to tell me, and she began to get better. She finished law school, got a job, and moved to mountainous Colorado, never knowing that according to ego psychology, woman's just another word for nothing left to lose. After this, I became a self-psychologist. I think Richard and Kohut would have gotten along quite well. Kohut hated the gloomy moralizing that saw narcissism as a selfish threat to heteronormativity. He thought development might lead people in all sorts of happy directions, many that didn't privilege love or family or humility. He thought people should be unrepentant about their narcissism and should celebrate rather than apologize for their passionate and immodest desires to shine. I think the guiding spirit of Richard was perhaps most with me when I treated an incredibly depressed and suicidal patient I'll call Drum. Drum was 48 years old when he was referred to me as an essentially hopeless case. He looked like a garden gnome as a result of horrible complications from failed bariatric surgery. He had almost nothing to say. One day he noticed I had a book on my phone table with a picture of a child and a polar bear on it. It was The Golden Compass, the first book of the His Dark Materials trilogy by Philip Pullman. He told me that he loved bears. He had a huge collection of teddy bears that he kept on industrial metal shelves in his apartment. He read The Golden Compass and loved it. He loved the bear on the cover and the fact that in the fictional world of the novel, every child had an animal familiar it could talk to because the shape-changing animal was the external half of the child's own soul. I asked Drum, given his love of animals, if he'd ever thought of getting a dog. Of course he had, he said, but he wouldn't. If he had a dog, he couldn't commit suicide, and it was his plan to kill himself before he was 50. But in time, he did get a wonderful therapy dog, a collie named Chase, who went everywhere with him, including into my office. Chase shed a lot, and I'm allergic to dog hair. The first time he came in, he stood up at the end of Drum's session and shook himself so vigorously that the office looked like a child's snow globe. I sneezed and sneezed, but only that one time. I never sneezed again. I have no idea why. One day, Drum told me that he'd read in the Times that his Dark Materials had been performed on the stage at the Royal National Theatre in London and had won the Olivier Prize for Best Play of the Year. It was in 2 parts, took 6 hours, and used giant life-size puppets in addition to human actors. It had just closed. I said, "Wow, too bad we couldn't have seen it." The play was over, so it seemed an undaring thing to say. Until 8 months later, Drum came in announcing that he'd read that the production was being remounted for the current season, given its great popularity. "You said it would be cool if we could have seen it," he said, breaking off. "Would you like to?" I said, seeing, not thinking. "Could we?" he asked. "Shrinks don't take patients to the theater." especially to the theater in London when they live in Chicago. I'm a big believer in therapeutic boundaries. They protect patients and they protect therapists. I've been a court-appointed supervisor of therapists who've gotten into trouble for violating boundaries. But Richard urges that we be careful not simply to take things on faith. All of the reasons that it would be wrong ordinarily to see someone like Drum outside of the office seemed, when I thought about it, and I spent a lot of time talking to my wisest senior colleagues, not to apply in his very particular case. So we went. The experience was indescribable. Drum had always felt like an untouchable to himself, and somehow flying across the ocean with me and with our son Charlie, he was the reason that I'd been reading the book in the first place. It was his favorite, and he wasn't going to miss the play. And Robin, and then going to the theater with us, affected Drum in an unimaginably powerful and positive way. A year later, he died. He was with his first girlfriend, and they were shopping, and he had a heart attack. What I've been trying to suggest is that Richard taught me to question everything, to look for the freshness and joy and possibility in everything. And if I am good at being a psychoanalyst, what Richard taught me and continues to teach me whenever we get together has everything to do with why. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, he was a pretty good student. And to say he's become a friend just understates the matter. He was best man at our wedding. I think he knew before I did that the one I finally met at some point named Camille was the woman I was going to marry. I think I met him after either the first or the second date he'd had with his now wife, Robin, and it was clear to me that she was the one he was going to marry. So it's been a long and happy relationship. It was a wonderful experience working with Jeffrey on his dissertation because he tackled things that I didn't think there was an answer to. So, I mean, I particularly remember, he would hand me these pages and pages of extremely rough drafts that would have these brilliant insights in them. And when he was working on Pericles, I remember him figuring out why there was this scene of cannibalism in Pericles, something which I had never had an answer to and kind of thought was a question, but thought there would be no answer to it. And Jeffrey had a wonderful answer. And that was the experience of working on the dissertation, asking questions that you'd think couldn't possibly be answered, and then actually working out answers to them. And of course, Jeffrey told me at the time that he wasn't sure he wanted to be an English professor, that he thought he might want to be a psychotherapist, and that the same training would work. And I said, well, whatever you say. I can, with luck, help working on Shakespeare, but who knows whether this will work in real life, so to speak. And lo and behold, some 30-odd years later, Jeffrey is now an extremely distinguished psychoanalyst, and I'm going to claim total credit for it.
The next speaker is Chris Hodgkins, who got his PhD in 1988. Chris is now at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. Chris and I were both in what I believe was the first iteration of the Richard's Renaissance Intellectual Texts seminar back in the 1980s, and Chris is speaking on Mr. Stryer's elegant tweezers.
Back in October of 2008, at the George Herbert Society conference at my home campus at UNC Greensboro, Richard Strier addressed the crowd in a keynote which asked about Herbert the question that we asked today about Richard. What makes him so great? all of us speaking here today face the same challenge. How, in the few minutes given to each of us, can we sum up Richard's great and multifaceted career? And how do we describe our own scholarly and personal experiences of Richard that have drawn us all back to Chicago today from as far away as China, and in my case, from North Carolina? Fortunately, to an unusual and unique degree, Richard's own work speaks for itself, and will continue to do so, I think, in coming generations. Richard is not exactly shy or reticent, and his body of work needs no defense, but his retirement does call for reflection, so that we and our students can continue to learn not only from his work itself, but also from his example about how we do our work. How can we do justice to the variety of the man in his academic achievements? Award-winning teacher, respected administrator, distinguished service professor, innovative editor of a great literary journal, debate-changing scholar, and life-changing mentor. Richard has always sought to work free of partisan and ideological labels. He has remained consistently open to new critical approaches as long as their questions continue to open our great texts and their contexts to fresh understandings. But he turns resistant when these approaches harden into pieties and parties and begin answering their own questions in advance. An eloquent defender of impossible radicalism in Renaissance texts, he also takes unfashionably conservative positions on the intrinsic and enduring value of these texts themselves. A lifelong progressive in his politics and a cheerful atheist, Richard knows that there is no progress without preservation, and has done more to enrich our sympathetic appreciation of early modern religious poetry and the love of God that it entails than any man alive. Richard, I remember once hearing you say at a staff meeting for Form Problem Event, I think it was, back in my days as a U of C lecturer, that over the years you'd come to appreciate a particular conservative argument. I think it was Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France or something like that. And that you now, having been the revolutionary enfant terrible of the English department, were on your way to becoming an old fart, I believe is how you put it. That was a quarter century ago. But all farts aside, and all kidding aside, you're the living ideal of the fearless liberal mind and the generous liberal imagination at work. After all these decades, after all the earthquakes in critical theory and fashion, you're still restlessly seeking those indispensably unattainable things called truth and beauty, and having a ball in the process. And speaking of having a ball, personally, I thank you for introducing me to truly fresh lox and bagels, and to tangy Retsina wine at the Courtyards of Plaka restaurant. Thank you for being great company at many conferences and confabs over the years as our teacher-student relationship grew into genuine friendship. Thank you for sharing my interest in James Stewart, both the Scottish king who presided over a fair bit of the later English Renaissance and gave his name to that famous translation of the Bible, but also to that other fellow named James Stewart, who stood up to all the James P. Taylors and the Henry F. Potters of the world, who reminded us that liberty is too precious a thing to be shut up in books, and that all the common riffraff should be able to do all their working and paying and living and dying in a couple of decent rooms and a bath. Above all, Richard, thank you for teaching us, in Wittgenstein's words, don't think, but look, and for being the best professional noticer that I know. Speaking of noticing, Richard once proudly told me, and perhaps some of you too, about the time at Harvard when he had delivered another long and excruciatingly observed dissertation chapter on Henry Vaughan to his thesis director, Herschel Baker. When Richard showed up for his tutorial a few days later, Professor Baker greeted him thus, in the honeyed tones of the South. "Well, Mr. Stryer, I see that you have gotten out your tweezers again." In fact, inspired by this anecdote, I personally can provide no more fitting tribute to Richard's career than the following poem. In the great verse essay tradition of Marvel and Pope, and especially of Dr. Seuss, I strive to answer those two burning questions of the day. What does make him so great? And what on earth rhymes with tweezers? So, Richard, here goes. Mr. Stryer's Elegant Tweezers, a brief essay in verse. To Chicago's East Campus, some call Harvard College, that fruitfulest nursery of pre-potted knowledge, and hothouse to all the great critical geezers, slouched, resistant young Stryer with his elegant tweezers. Then spake Herschel Baker that Renaissance dawn of the 600th page of Stryer's thesis on Vaughan. I see, Mr. Stryer, and for this I thank Jesus, that again you've applied your most elegant tweezers. That's right, the bold Stryer unrepentantly said, I'll winkle and probe where'er poetry is read. I'll defy the pat theories of the big critical cheeses. Hey world, look out for my elegant tweezers. So he tweezed and he twosed till his tweezler was sore. As he probed every theorem, all the critical lore, impatient with shibboleths and fixed Ebenezers, snicker-snack with those vorpal but elegant tweezers. Just like that, said Rosamond Tuve on the Temple. Just like that, said the Marxist. Class warfare, quite simple. Just like that, said the decons and all their appeasers. But they reckoned without Stryer's elegant tweezers. Could Shakespeare praise rebels? Did Donne squint awry too? Was Milton immodest, unhumble? Who knew? Was Fish brilliantly wrong about Herbert? What teasers? What wonders sussed out by those elegant tweezers? Art's structures, like Stryer, are strangely resistant to preconceived systems, however insistent. Don't go all dogmatic on life's Mona Lisas, or you'll feel the sharp sting of those elegant tweezers. How elegant? Swellegant. Stryer is a rarity, a critic composing with verve, wit, and clarity, like a Bauhaus designed by a whole team of Mises. Substance meets style when Stryer wields the tweezers. That scourge of all overblown doctrinaire isms, that watchdog of all ideological prisms, that scoffer at all unnecessary schisms, that change small divides to abyssal abysms. Yes, Stryer loves his wine and his food, come from France, but Frenchified thinking, he looks sometimes askance. Do you feel under-theorized? Lo, this thought eases. Go get your own set of these Stryerific tweezers. Why not question both about elements formal and historical too? Is it really abnormal to work free of all those scheming policers and go where thought leads with your own set of tweezers? And now he retires. Can his mind really rest from its healthy repining so restlessly blessed? Will he play the mere tourist with a life of stamped visas and lay up for good his most elegant tweezers? Not a chance, though his travels may take him from home to Paris, to Gary, Mogadishu, or Rome. Wherever the ideologues can't, the brain freezes. Stryer kindles a fire with his sparky old tweezers. So it goes, like that pulley that Herbert so praises. He restlessly, freely, enrichingly raises us all with his questions and cures critics' diseases. Dr. Stryer, here's to you and your elegant tweezers.
Thanks, Chris. That was great. That was wonderful. So when I met Chris Hodgkins many years ago, I thought this was a very, very bright young man, and I was really delighted that he took such an intense interest in George Herbert, one of my great favorites. But I thought that I had one worry about Chris. He was very intense, and I thought the problem with him was he was a little too solemn. I have come to realize one of the pleasures of getting to know someone after their graduate career, which is a pretty solemn experience for most people. And I can't say I was completely delighted when Herschel told me I'd gotten out my tweezers again. Because the previous occasion like that, he told me I was a member of the scorched earth school of criticism. But nonetheless, we got along. And, but it's only really in his post-student days that I realized what an incredible wit and sense of humor Chris had. And I think we were at a conference, I can't remember which one it was, when I first heard him do his Jimmy Stewart imitation, and I have to confess, I did request it for this occasion. But I did not know I was going to get this remarkable verse tribute. But to be slightly serious for a moment, I remember, it's very interesting to remember sort of key moments in one's relation with a really brilliant student working on one's favorite poet. And I remember we were sitting in my very crummy office over in Gates Blake, which some of you remember before the English department moved to its current grand territory, and saying to Chris, there's this stanza in one of George Herbert's poems, a poem no one pays any attention to, called Lent, a poem nobody cares about. For every, there are hundreds of pages on the altar or Love 3 and 2 pages on Lent somewhere. Said, but in fact, there's a stanza in this poem about authority and how it's supposed to work that I just don't understand. And I think if someone could understand this stanza, they'd have a whole new book on Herbert. And Chris's first book did that, actually took that stanza and wrote the book that was needed to understand it. So it's a pleasure in so many ways to see people's work developed. And Chris is now probably one of the major Herbert scholars in the world and the co-editor of a wonderful website on Herbert's poetry. And turns out to be an amazingly funny guy. Who knew?
Our next speaker is Orrin Wang. Orrin got his PhD here in 1989. He now teaches at the University of Maryland at College Park. And his title is How Do We Think?
First, I want to thank Eric for taking the lead in organizing this symposium in honor of Richard. The logistics for an undertaking of this kind is always daunting, and Eric seems to have pulled everything off with great style. Second, I want to thank you all for letting me, Johnny-come-lately English romanticist, be a part of this early modern celebration. And finally, of course, I want to thank Richard and Camille for having me here. Like all of you, I feel keenly the debt that I owe Richard for the part that he's played in my intellectual training, and it's an honor to have an opportunity to speak about that in public. My title comes from the first question, forever impressed upon me Lockean style, that Richard asked me during my dissertation defense. Orrin, how do you think? Remembering that moment with Richard's laser-like, intensely curious look boring down on me, many of you here know what I mean, I wonder that I didn't simply say, at the moment, just barely. Indeed, Percy Shelley has a line in his poem, The Triumph of Life, when the character Rousseau refers to a moment when suddenly my brain became as sand. And it's difficult for me not to associate that line with how I felt when Richard asked me that and numerous other pointed questions during my education here at Chicago. Given that my dissertation was on a number of critical theorists, there was a pointed, if at the moment surprising logic to Richard's question. But like many of Richard's queries, this one also had the virtue of being generative, something you could go back to time and time again. And so I'd like to take this occasion to reframe Richard's question and reflect upon how do we, Richard's students, think because of our time with him? Or more exactly, how do we aspire to think because of Richard? What would Richard think? If not, what would Richard do? Unlike Martin Luther, I only have 6 theses to share with you today. I had to cut some, and I'm sure you all could come up with many more on your own. Here, at any rate, I humbly submit the following. Thesis number 1, how do we think or try to think because of Richard? Fearlessly and tenaciously. Fearlessly because if something's troubling us, if something doesn't make sense to us, that's what we zero in on. That's where we know we should apply our effort and where the payoff is. Tenaciously, because once we zero in on what's troubling us, we don't let go. Intellectual writing can oftentimes be an avoidance project where we use our critical languages and learned moves to circle around where the heavy lifting actually needs to occur. I've seen that in myself and in my students. And every time I nudge my students toward where they need to go, if they want really to find both clarity and significance in their work, I think of Richard. Though, of course, a Stryer nudge could leave you fairly bruised the next day and appear in the OED as an example of an understatement, if not quite technically a leitmotif. Thesis number 2, how do we think because of Richard? Well, we try to think all the time. I can remember being here at Chicago and when calculating how long it might take me to drop off a book at the Regenstein or do some other chore on campus, always having to factor X amount of time into the equation, just in case I ran into someone and ended up getting into a deep discussion about my work. A number of people at Chicago could be that someone, not only faculty, but also members of my own cohort. But in a rather overdetermined fashion, when I stage that recollected encounter in my mind's eye, the someone I think of first and foremost is Richard. That seems entirely appropriate, as Richard really does emblematize for me a Chicago ethos that, if not completely singular, is still rare, not only outside the academy, but also among other universities and schools as well. Anywhere, at any time with Richard, you could find yourself in a deeply involved discussion of ideas. At any moment, any offhand comment you made could cause Richard to tilt his head and ask quizzically, "What do you mean by that?" And then you were off. And hopefully you had brought your A game with you, which leads me to thesis number 3. How do we try to think because of Richard? We try to think honestly. No one likes to have a blind spot in their writing project pointed out to them. And no one especially likes to have a blind spot that they knew was there pointed out. Freud, of course, has taught us knowing is a tricky thing, and that's especially true about our own work. Perhaps honestly appraising our own work is something we can only strive to do. We can, however, approach our own work with rigor, responsibility, and open skepticism. Traits Richard all helped me to learn, and in doing so, we can at least own up to what we produce. So, thesis number 4, how do we think because of Richard? The same way we read. As literary critics, we do many things, but at the end of the day, we all read. And I know if today I read or try to read fiercely, tenaciously, or honestly, that's in many ways because of Richard. If I don't know what I'm going to find before I read, and if I'm galvanized, not intimidated by that fact, that's because of my respect for and curiosity about the resistant structures of a text that Richard has helped me to recognize. Paul de Man once said that the deceptively simple task of teaching reading was first and foremost what pedagogy in our discipline is about. He put that above any affect or emotion between teacher and student that the scene of teaching might incur. The warmth and affection I believe we all feel today at this gathering for Richard belies that view, or at least demonstrates that learning to read well and feeling a personal connection to one's teacher need not be mutually exclusive acts. At any rate, when I think of Richard thinking, I think of him reading, whether the text be Herbert's, Shakespeare's, Dickinson's, Cavell's, or the work of a student or colleague. Which leads me to thesis number 5. How do we think because of Richard, or how might we have thought because of Richard, with a number 2 pencil in our hand? We are, as we all well know, in the middle of a digital revolution. But what word edit program or other paper grading software will ever approximate the emphatic intensity of a Richard Strier comment, cross-out, query, or exclamation point, engraved with graphite on our papers and chapters, and by extension, here's Locke again, our mind and hearts. Surely the very definition of that term popularized by Deleuze and others, the haptic, a tactile encounter experienced visually, can be found in the reading of a Richard Strier marked up paper. You felt the paper. As I began my teaching career beyond Chicago, Richard once remarked to me that those teaching notes we come up with for our first college class have a concentrated mental written energy that can't be matched. One could say the same about the written comments of Richard Strier. I assume that many of you here have received such remarks. At the time when I received mine, they seemed a bit like Derrida's definition of writing as the pharmacon, where I couldn't be sure the treatment would aid or worsen my health. Today, I feel honored to have survived and indeed benefited from Richard's script. More than anything, I feel gratitude. It's pretty difficult to overstate the intellectual generosity my teachers at Chicago showed me. Certainly, that was the case with Richard, who for quite some time skewed my sense of what the role of a third reader on a dissertation was, as he edited and scrutinized huge chunks of my written work. In doing so, he modeled for me a mode of thinking, reading, and writing that has held me in good stead to this day. As I said, I had to leave out some other theses about thinking and Richard that I don't have space to pursue. How, for example, we think or try to think intensely, carefully, and with enthusiasm, the final term one that might seem quite appropriate to mention before a gathering of early modernists. But this is a celebration, and so I conclude with thesis number 6. How do we think with Richard? With wine, of course. I confess I have yet to read Richard's latest study, The Unrepentant Renaissance, but if it is, as I understand it to be, a study of a writer's unrepentance about pleasures, both intellectual and physical, about the enjoyment of taste as a fundamental category of a human life, well, then I assume it is at some level, like all good criticism, autobiographical. Many things are legendary about Richard, not least his wine cellar, which I had the honor of seeing, I believe, close to its inception almost 25 years ago. I gather it's expanded a bit.
I'm afraid so.
Yeah, that's a lightity. I don't really know my wines, but I do know appreciating a good wine has something to do with knowing its past, understanding its making in a different time and place, and feeling a connection with that event. It means working to sharpen your senses and opening yourself up to details, gradations, and nuances that others might miss. It means being a scholar and a critic in the very best sense of those words. It means thinking like Richard Strier. How do we think? Tonight, with Richard and Camille, with our glasses raised, in gratitude for our past learning, and appreciation for the many moments of taste we experienced with them, and for those to come.
Thank you, Orrin. And Orrin is extremely important in this gathering because he's the only living representative in this room of work I've done with people who weren't officially in either the Renaissance or the early American period. And Myles is here as representing my work with some Americanists, but still more or less within the 17th century context. And it's really, it has been one of my pleasures at Chicago to be able to work with brilliant students with whom we shared interests that weren't strictly within my own period. And I think I became involved with Orrin's dissertation just because we had so many wonderful conversations about de Man and Bloom and Cavell. And it turned out he was writing a dissertation on these people, and it just seemed natural to be part of it. And it's only now, in retrospect, that I realized how brave it was of Orrin to include me, because after all, I think your other dissertation advisors were Mitchell and Chandler, card-carrying romanticists of world-class stature, and then suddenly to include someone who not only wasn't in the period, but was thought by many to be uninterested in literary theory in this dissertation on literary theory was actually very brave of you. And I have to say, I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I think got to tell Orrin a story about what it was like to sort of have lunch with Paul de Man on a series of Fridays, and because he was here for a while for teaching a seminar, and he didn't know anybody, and we had a friend in common from when he taught at Cornell. And we were both working on, we're just written on metaphor recently and published in Critical Inquiry on metaphor. So we'd have these series of lunches on Fridays. And I learned a lot from this because Damon, if you knew him, had this very accommodating French manner, this sort of, oh, yes, of course, you're right, of course. But after that came, but. And just as I thought I was getting him to sort of concede something, to say maybe he actually had gotten something slightly wrong. Now, meanwhile, I thought he'd gotten a lot of things wrong. But, you know, one proceeds one thing at a time. And so we're working on a paragraph, and he's giving me the, and then finally we get in there, he says, no, I don't think so. So I have to say that it was a pleasure to work with Orrin, who was deeply interested in all of these thinkers who were themselves deeply interested in his topic, Romanticism, but who also had a sense that, bright as they were not deities. And I think this allowed us to work together very, very happily and to have another lifelong relationship. Thank you.
I had initially left myself off the program because I will be talking enough today and this evening. But I wonder if I could have just sort of 2 minutes to talk about how Richard changed my career. When I left Chicago, not long after, Stanley Wells approached me and asked if I would write the annual review of editions and textual studies for Shakespeare's Survey, the leading journal and certainly leading UK Shakespeare journal. I was petrified. I was an assistant professor through the good graces of David Bevington, who had allowed me to co-edit some editions of Marlowe with him while I was still a graduate student. I had a couple of publications, but I had no international reputation. I didn't know what to do. You know, what could I do to critique Colin Burroughs' magisterial edition of Shakespeare's Sonnets and Poems? For those of you who know this, it's a 700-page critical edition. But I knew that I could close read. I'd been taught well. So I decided to do this. I sat down with Colin Burroughs' Lucrece, and I sat down with the Quarto of Lucrece, and I read it closely. And one interesting thing happens when you do this. You find that Colin Burroughs has not read it that closely. Whereas Colin Burroughs tells us that as Tarquin approaches Lucrece, his inward will, no outward harm expressed. That's not the word. It's inward ill, no outward harm expressed. Colin had got it wrong and never noticed. And to make matters worse, Colin had written scholarly notes on will that it was a tension with often a secondary sense of sexual desire, and sometimes, as in the sonnets, a play on sexual organs. It went on, and in the next line, that refers back to the inward will. And I suddenly had something to say about Colin Burroughs' edition. So I went on, and the Venus and Adonis I read closely. And whereas Colin says she reweaves the web that she hath wrought, in actually the line is she unweaves. It's a Penelope reference. And what's fascinating about this is when you start doing, you keep finding them. So with yokes her silver does by whose, it's not sweet aid, it's swift aid. The most difficult thing about writing this review, though, was I was astonished. This is the text. This is the most important part. And I wanted to trash Colin Burroughs. And Richard came to me in a dream, actually. And said, as he had written on my dissertation at one point, they're not criminals. These are critics who have made a mistake. They made a slip, they got something wrong, but they're not evil. And so I managed to chart a middle course of pointing out the significant errors that had been made without challenging the critics as human beings. And so Colin Burrow no longer comes by and shoots out my porch light every year. But what was, oh, there's still more, sorry. It's not disorder breathes by heating of the blood, it breeds. Every edition that would come across my desk as a reviewer, I would do this to. And you discover remarkable things. This is Jill Levinson's Oxford text of Romeo and Juliet, in which she included the first quarto. As I was reading the first quarto, you discover she left out 6 lines of the play and didn't notice this. Now, my reviews became the thing everyone would turn to when they got to Shakespeare Survey. And it wasn't any special gift but no other reviewer was noticing this, because no one else was sitting down with sort of the care and attention to the text of the play. And so most reviewers stay on for 3 years. I did it for 13. And it was because of my reputation as a careful reviewer of text. Actually, David Scott Caston said, editors, he's one of the general editors for the Ardent Shakespeare, said, editors are really concerned about your review, so they're spending a lot of time paying attention to their text. Great! I can die happy. Well, and because of my reputation as a reviewer, Jonathan Bate, when he was looking for a co-editor for the complete works of Shakespeare for the Royal Shakespeare Company, asked me to join him in that project. And when this appeared 5 or 6 years ago, I was just so concerned that every critic who was lying in wait, and they'd be sending me just lists of all the errors that I made. It's been remarkable that no one has done this. I don't claim that it's an error-free edition, but I haven't been. So I guess it's a fairly careful one. The remarkable thing is that it was quite well received. The sharpest criticism I got was at a Shakespeare Association meeting, and it came from Dr. Stryer, who quite appropriately said he was concerned that we based it on the first folio and had not included the quarto text, and I remember said pointedly, how can you claim it's a complete work if you've left out of the quarto? And Richard is surely right about this. Every other critic was obsessed with the color. Under the banner headline in the London Review of Books, the yellow Shakespeare, Michael Dobson wrote that the RSC's boards, like the spine of its dust jacket, are a violent shade of mustard, liable to be as immediately noticeable in a bookshop or a scholarly library as Malvolio's stockings in Olivia's morning household. We figured there was one yellow nut out there, but we were wrong. Writing in the Daily Telegraph, Ann Wilson said, "The new mustard-colored Shakespeare has certainly brightened my life, and not just because it is yellow. Germans publish a lot of yellow books, such as the Langenscheidt dictionaries, but these were until now the only yellow books in my room." Writing in the TLS, Peter Holland said, "The RSC Shakespeare is a handsome piece of bookmaking, for all that the cover design suggests the future marketing of matching curtains." Richard Stryer's legacy for me has been the absolute anal retentive care with which I give to every text that I look at. And I want to close by saying that this bugs me beyond belief. This is the cover for the paperback of Julius Caesar. And on the cover, there is a Roman coin. The Roman coin has Nero on it. Nero lived several centuries after Julius Caesar. The possibility of a Nero coin being splattered with Caesar's blood is sort of an ontological impossibility. I really blame Richard that I'm so bothered by this. That's all I wanted to say.
Well, of course, the trouble with Eric is he has so little personality. You know, just kind of a dull, drab guy, the way you'd think a really hard-nosed editor would be. Now, I have to say that unlike with Professor Hodgkins, I think even when Eric was a student, I kind of knew he had a bit of a twinkle and a bit of an edge, and you could see it even then. Although I remember for the intellectual text seminar, he wrote an extremely sober paper. I was quite surprised that it was a very solemn affair indeed. And I want to thank Eric again for all the work he did in organizing this event. And I was actually quite surprised and delighted by something in his talk, because I don't think I've ever been praised for restraint and mildness before. So that was good. I'm glad to know that I actually prevented altercations between critics, because it's sort of not a role I'm normally cast in. And it's as with so many of the others in the room, I mean, part of the pleasure of having the job that I've been privileged to have is not just having the wonderful students, but them having afterwards them become friends. And Eric and I share not only our love of Shakespeare and a sort of maniacal desire to get things right, if humanly possible, but also a just fanatical love of good food and wine. And I'm happy to have Eric travel in those footsteps as well as in the scholarly ones.
Our next speaker is Ann Myles from the University of Northern Iowa, speaking on she received her PhD in 1993. She's speaking on querying the Puritan Anne Bradstreet or not.
Well, I'm honored today to be included in this illustrious event, although as the only early Americanist in a room full of English Renaissance scholars here in the capital of academe, I feel a degree of colonial anxiety that is probably very fitting to my subject. And the self-doubting opening stanzas of Anne Bradstreet's prologue have been running in my head over the past few days with a more personal connection than usual. But I hope this mean and unrefined ore of mine will nonetheless show how I carry on Richard's legacy in close readings of both poets and Puritanism. It came to me recently that my first opportunity to teach poetry came when Richard asked me to be a TA in his Introduction to Poetry class, and it has remained something that I love to do and do quite a lot of. I'm sure I have some students who could tell stories of me waxing passionate about just how erotic metrics are, though I doubt I can claim any converts yet to that level of appreciation. More important, Richard was my second reader for my dissertation about early American and particularly Puritan dissent, and that has remained the focus of my scholarship. One incident I particularly recall has some indirect bearing on my talk today. He said, I think it was to my parents around the time of my graduation, that one notable thing about me as a student was that he or someone else would give me advice, and I would listen and think about it carefully and then do what I wanted anyway. And I confess, Richard, I never have managed to work in Martin Luther, though I have never forgotten that you think I should. I don't know that this independence has served me well, but I do recognize in it my determination to follow the line of my own deep inclinations, which seems connected to the fact that scholarship arises in a very personal place for me. Not long after graduation, one thing I came to recognize was that my interest in religious dissent was partly a kind of allegory for sexual dissent and an allegiance to the queer, and so queer readings of 17th century New England materials have emerged as one strand in my work in recent years. But pursuing such readings can feel like the impossible task of writing about what's not even really there, on top of what sometimes feels like the slightly insane, although surely Richard licensed, project of doing literary close readings of New England polemical texts that often seem the opposite of artful. Yet at some level, the very impossibility of this, of exploring a kind of erotics that does not really exist in bodily terms, but might circulate in a spiritual and affective register, is very appealing to me. Anyway, my paper represents another step in my queer reading of Puritanism and my stumble into discovering that after many years of teaching Anne Bradstreet, I might finally have something to say about her. But it begins with the challenge of the impossible, and maybe the resistant, to use a word that has been circulating today. About a year and a half ago, I saw a call for papers for an Anne Bradstreet at 400 conference that I thought would be fun to attend if I could come up with something to present. And one of the suggested topics mentioned queer approaches to Bradstreet. I remember sitting in my office with my mind racing because it seemed like such a bizarre proposition for the great poet of Puritan marital love. So how would one pursue this unlikely task? The call referred to the trace of identification with male-male love in Bradstreet's poem, David's Lamentation for Saul and Jonathan. Since Bradstreet is a woman writer and I a lesbian reader, I also thought about the issue of connections between women in her poetry. And the first thing that struck me was how very few women appear in her poetry at all, though women were surely central to her daily lived experience. They're all dead, for one thing, and in the poem that expresses the strongest private emotion towards a woman, her elegy on her daughter-in-law Mercy, she rapidly elides her own grief to focus on her son's appropriately heterosexual mourning. Everything that came up for me involved the absence of the queer in Bradstreet, or the containment of same-sex affection under the sign of death and loss. And the more I thought about this, the more it interested me. What if we do not simply take the sidelining of same-sex dynamics in her work for granted, but rather explore the meaning of this absence? Before I go on, I think I want to explain my own way of theorizing the queer in a Puritan context, that I'm not interested so much in approaches focused on the transgression of gender norms or other destabilizing moves, or in Bradstreet's celebration of powerful and unruly women in history, which some other scholars have pursued. My own interests are grounded in the idea of spiritual erotics, structures of emotion or desire within a religious culture that can work in certain lateral same-sex affiliative patterns rather than the hierarchical and heterosexual pattern that is the model for the family of the state. I've been deeply influenced by Michael Warner's important essay, New English Sodom, in which among other things points out how Massachusetts Governor John Winthrop's foundational lay sermon, A Model of Christian Charity, offers a theory of erotic attraction to explain the bonds of affection that are to knit Christian society together. And this theory of attraction, based in Winthrop's idea of simile gaudit, or like will to like, puts the essentially homoerotic model of likeness at the heart of the Puritan social vision. If you accept this reading, then, the queer is not necessarily other to Puritanism, but always exists as a rich yet destabilizing potentiality within Puritanism itself. Let me now move to Bradstreet's one potentially same-sex poem. David's Lamentation over Saul and Jonathan, the second to last poem in the 1650 10th Muse, is based on 2 Samuel chapter 1. While many critics usefully read the poem in political terms as a lament from New England over the fall of Old England, it does evoke homoerotic themes in the key lines, where David turns to directly address his fallen friend. Distressed for thee I am, dear Jonathan. Thy love was wonderful, surpassing man, exceeding all the love that's feminine. So pleasant hath thou been, dear brother mine. It's hard to know how much weight to place on the inclusions of these lines in a poem that's basically a straight biblical paraphrase. What spurred my own thinking about the poem was one critic, Elizabeth First, drawing a connection between the poem and John Winthrop's famous evocation of David and Jonathan in a model, right as the part of his discourse on love based in likeness that Warner reads as implicitly queer, a discourse that Anne Bradstreet presumably heard firsthand on board the Arbella in 1630. Winthrop is describing how it is between members of Christ, each discerns by the work of the Spirit his own image and resemblance in another, and therefore cannot but love him as he loves himself. He expresses in rather heated terms the delight and longing that the soul experiences towards this other who is also self, a desire he analogizes to the bond between Adam and Eve, David and Jonathan, and Ruth and Naomi. Focusing on how Winthrop handles David and Jonathan leads me to disagree with previous claims that in writing a poem on these figures, Bradstreet is aping Winthrop. What stands out to me is the strikingly different way Bradstreet deploys the material and the markedly different visions or versions of Puritanism that emerge. Winthrop uses the same-sex love of the pair to highlight the erotics of resemblance that binds together the community. Bradstreet, by contrast, refers to this love only under the sign of death and loss. They are, for that matter, working with two different parts of the story. Winthrop is drawing from the fuller story of David and Jonathan that begins in 1 Samuel with a key line in chapter 20, referring to how Jonathan loved David as he loved his own soul. Bradstreet is paraphrasing a later passage on the deaths from 2 Samuel. These fine distinctions are interesting in themselves, but they take on more significance when we consider the rest of Bradstreet's religious poetry, though there was unfortunately no time to explore it in detail. What we observe is how far apart her rendering of what it means to live and feel as a New England Puritan stands tonally from Winthrop's model. Where Winthrop invokes the erotics of Christian similitude as the basis for successfully living out the community's covenantal bond of marriage to God, Bradstreet's writing consistently emphasizes God's otherness and the resistant individual human whose will must be bent to acceptance. There is chastisement, acceptance, and a promise of heavenly compensation, but no religious joy in her poetry, and for that matter, little sense of community. Winthrop's words, as well as much other first-generation writing, including the sermons of Bradstreet's minister, John Cotton, remind us that this is not the necessary or default voice of early New England Puritanism, a stance we have been too prone to slip into when reading Bradstreet. It is a dimension of Puritanism, certainly, and it is Bradstreet's Puritanism, the conflictual terms in which she occupies her faith. And to make a large, quick leap, just as her spiritual emphasis falls on opposition rather than similarity as a core spiritual principle, so love in her poetry is almost entirely contained within the oppositional erotics of heterosexuality. Thus, despite the challenges Bradstreet unquestionably offers to patriarchal inscriptions of gender, I argue that we need to see Bradstreet as a writer who profoundly resists attempts at a queer reading, or rather, one whose refusal to engage the queer potentialities within her culture a queer reading helps reveal. The remaining question, of course, is why. Gendered and historical elements clearly account for much of this. The privilege of male church members creates a permissible space for the erotics of resemblance in Winthrop and others, a dynamic that would become much more destabilizing if extended to women, especially after the antinomian crisis. But I will conclude by throwing out a speculative biographical reading, one at least that consoles me by rendering Bradstreet's resistance to the erotics of likeness queerly particular and moving, and one that it now occurs to me may trace its distant origins to Richard's own fearlessness about affirming the human experience and emotion at the heart of religious and literary expression. Consider Bradstreet's description of the bodily crisis of her smallpox attack in her autobiographical prose piece, To My Dear Children. She writes, "About 16, the Lord laid his hand sore upon me and smote me with smallpox. When I was in my affliction, I besought the Lord and confessed my pride and vanity, and he again restored me." We may detect a hint of her intense emotion about the physical disfigurement of smallpox in lines in the original 1650 version of The Four Ages, where youth states, "Sometimes the loathsome pox my face bemars with ugly marks of his eternal scars," lines that Bradstreet later cloaked in more allegorical, less visual imagery. During and after her smallpox, Bradstreet would have experienced a severe disruption of her ability to identify with her own image. Looking in a mirror, she would not have resembled herself, or at least any version of herself she could love. And if she was like any other teenage girl, the vanity and follies of youth she confesses as the implied cause for her affliction might well have included a pleasurable interest in her own appearance. Essentially, getting smallpox might have proved the mortal danger of any erotics of identification. To love one's own likeness became for Bradstreet the primal sin. So how then could she enter into the erotics of like will to like? And immediately after this passage, Bradstreet describes her marriage and journey to New England. Marriage, yes, in which she could exist in relation to her husband's gaze rather than to her own image, and coming to New England, but with no recorded sense of sympathy with the body of Christ, such as Winthrop evoked on the Arbella, only the conflictual spirituality of submitting to the will of God and joining the church. Thus, the dynamics that inform her poetry may have been set in motion by a formative trauma of body and identification, one that disrupted her ability to even imagine such queer erotics as might be implicit and allowable within her community, or to do so, as in her treatment of David and Jonathan, only as something always already lost and lamented. While Richard is retiring, and there is loss in that for current students and colleagues, today's occasion is certainly not one of lament. And indeed, it strikes me how deeply today resonates with the rhetoric of Winthrop's model. While in the outer world of academia, it appears that in all times some must be rich, some poor, such hierarchies are balanced or trumped by the allegiances and delights that bind us, as we find, as Winthrop said, our own image and resemblance in another. We celebrate Richard's image in our own work and feel the power of like will to like, knitting us as a community of scholars across decades, across institutional identities, and even across the boundary between the British scholars and the Americanists.
Well, I'm especially moved and delighted to have Anne here because her presence here puts me in mind of, it's a triumph in itself, but puts me in mind of a professional loss. And I think it's interesting in an occasion like this to mention things that didn't go as one had hoped in one's career. When I was writing my dissertation, I completely outraged the great sort of Renaissance poetry and poetry man at Harvard, Reuben Brower, by not choosing him as my second reader. Herschel Baker, of course, despite the fact that he made fun of me all the time, had to be my first reader because he was the great intellectual historian and the one who was interested in religion. But I chose as my second reader a wonderful, gruff, brilliant, totally crude and out of control American Puritan scholar named Alan Heimert, who was Perry Miller's star student and taught from Perry Miller's index cards. And Heimert and I had always seen eye to eye, even though Baker talked like a Southern gentleman. Heimer talked like a truck driver. Stryer, read any good pamphlets lately? And I would show him a new book on Puritanism, and he'd read it and say, pretty good, almost as good as Perry. And so my dissertation was filled with references to American Puritan materials, and I thought in some ways the closest theological figure in the period to my version of Herbert was John Cotton. And it's all over the place in Love Known, and nobody noticed it. Nobody, I mean, the book was very nicely treated by the Herbert world, but nobody noticed that all this early American stuff in it. And, but, you know, I went blithely on thinking that, of course, it was the same culture, and that I would have lots of students interested in early American literature, and Puritanism was an Anglo-American movement. And it turned out there were very few, that Anne was one of the very few students working on American stuff who saw me as someone who might be a resource for them. So it's just one of those, I mean, our field is, I mean, our literary studies in general, is still, I think, somewhat tormented by artificial distinctions. And so I'm very glad that I can at least point to one student who wasn't troubled by the fact, just as Orrin wasn't troubled by the fact that I wasn't an official romanticist or an official literary theorist, Anne wasn't troubled by the fact that I wasn't an official early American person, even though I kind of thought I was. So anyhow, I'm very, very glad to have Anne here.
Our next speaker is Laura Bates, who received her PhD in 1998. She teaches now at Indiana State University, and the title of her talk is, "Oh, This Learning, What a Thing It Is."
Thank you, Eric. Happy to be here. And Richard, thank you. The theme today is to honor Richard Strier and to recognize his role in our own scholarship and career. What a great way to honor our professor. And what an impressive gathering of scholars. I feel deeply humbled to be a part of this illustrious group. I also feel, I confess, a little bit out of place, as I did when I first came to the University of Chicago way back in 1992. And that is where my own particular debt to Richard comes in. You see, I was what we call a non-traditional student. In other words, I was a bit older than the other kids. I had left and abandoned my undergraduate work to begin a career, actually, in journalism. When I finally decided to return to academia and pursue a PhD, I was nearly 20 years out of step with current trends in literary theory and Shakespearean scholarship. I was awed by my classmates, and I was utterly intimidated by my professors. I felt a little bit like Gremio in Taming of the Shrew. Oh, this learning, what a thing it is. Furthermore, I was a student in what was then called the Committee on Comparative Literature, not in the Department of English. And I met Richard through the Renaissance Workshop. He and David Bevington, who was my dissertation director, were the faculty sponsors of the Renaissance Workshop, and I was fortunate enough to be invited to serve as a student liaison. I was impressed with Richard's and David's enthusiastic support of student work, literally taking a back seat to student members at every gathering. And I was personally taken aback by Richard's insistent and persistent encouragement of my own work. I will never forget the day that he said to me those all-important 3 little words. You know, those 3 little words that we all long to hear. You should publish. He said those words to me on the day that I presented a chapter of my dissertation in progress to the Renaissance Workshop. My topic was the appropriation of Shakespeare during the 19th century period of nationalism in Latvia. Yes, Latvia. Does it get any more obscure than that? Honestly, I never considered publication because I assumed that a topic like that would be a kind of book that might be lucky to attract a handful of readers worldwide. Well, one of my select group of readers was Richard himself. As an example of his generosity, he agreed to serve as an extra reader on my dissertation, even though I was, as I said, in comparative literature and not in the Department of English. Of course, the manuscript benefited greatly from Richard's meticulous and thoughtful responses. But nevertheless, I have to confess that still I did not pursue publication. Flash forward some 15 years later, after I had received my degree, I rather recently had the pleasure of hosting Richard's visit to my own campus, Indiana State University. And once again, he repeated to me those three little words, "You should publish." I think he might have added a fourth. "You really should publish." Well, this time, Richard was encouraging my current work, which had nothing to do with Latvian nationalism. At that time, Richard's work, his current work, was focused on Shakespeare and the law, and you see one of the volumes here. My own work at that time was focused on Shakespeare and the lawless, specifically Shakespearean reception in solitary confinement, where I had been working for 10 years. The chapter, his own chapter in his collection, Shakespeare and the Law, is subtitled "The Better, the Worse." My work involved specifically supermax prisoners, where you might say the worse, the better. My Shakespeare in prison work was a topic that I finally felt had a wider appeal. And yes, finally, I did take Richard's advice to seek publication. And my book, my first book, called Shakespeare Saved My Life, 10 Years in Solitary with the Bard, has just recently been published. In that book, I share prisoners' interpretations of what I call Shakespeare's criminal tragedies, where the focus is primarily on Macbeth, even Hamlet, certainly Othello, also Romeo and Juliet, and even Taming of the Shrew. But in this talk today, I want to quote not from my book, but from Richard's, again, the volume called Shakespeare in the Law, that Richard co-edited with Braden Cormack and Martha Nussbaum. My favorite chapter actually is the final one, which represents a roundtable discussion that brought together Supreme Court judges and Shakespeare scholars. One topic that came up in a rather free-form, flowing conversation was a question of which of Shakespeare's characters you might identify with. Well, Richard replied, rather modestly, I think, that he could, and I'm quoting, aspire to Horatio. And he explained, again I'm quoting, Richard said, "I think there's a kind of egomania in thinking that any of us are likely to be reasonable facsimiles of Hamlet or Rosalind or any of these astonishing, brilliant creatures that Shakespeare created for his leads." End quote. Instead, Richard, in choosing to emulate a supporting character, noted that Horatio seems an honorable man. He also noted that it's important to recognize characters that are, and again I'm quoting, just ordinarily eloquent and ordinarily intelligent and ordinarily courageous and ordinarily loyal, end quote. Of course, we all gathered here today know that Richard is anything but ordinary. And today, I'd like to publicly thank Richard for his supporting role in my own scholarship, for his encouragement, and for him helping me to find my place in this brave new world of academia that has such people in it. Thank you, Richard.
I thought Shakespeare in Latvia was a great topic. I couldn't understand why Laura was so self-conscious about it, and it was extremely interesting. I mean, to find out. I mean, The Merchant of Venice was played very early. It was just. I mean, normally, I read dissertations, and I have something to add, but I already kind of know a fair amount about what I'm reading. But in this case, I read the dissertation. I thought, oh, that's interesting. Oh, that's interesting. So I mean, the sense. The sense that this was at all strange was not present to me, and I'm delighted that even though that possible book didn't happen, that another possible book did actually become a real thing. And if I had a hand in bringing it into the world, well, I'm glad to have that paternal role. Thanks, Laura.
Our next speaker is Sarah Squire, who works for the Liberty Fund, Inc., and her title is Tetchy and Wayward on Being Richard's Student.
Hi, Richard. I'm filled with trepidation as I come to the podium for a few reasons. One of these is that I haven't been back to the University of Chicago since I graduated, which means that I have this horrifying sense that... Well, exactly. Exactly. Or someone from the dissertation office is going to call me and say, you know, those footnote separators, not the right length. I'm a little nervous about that. I am deeply nervous because I will cheerfully admit to being Richard's most frivolous student. And I am also deeply nervous because I apparently have decided that the best way to toast Richard and his enormous influence on my work and on my life and my career is to compare him to Richard III. Oops. I know that I don't need to identify the quotation that marks the title of this talk for any of you because we're all Richard students, right? We can do that in our sleep. But since we're all Richard students, I got to make sure my footnotes are right. So I will note that this is from the Duchess of York's description of Richard III. She says of Richard, "Tetchy and wayward was thy infancy, thy school days frightful, desperate, wild, and furious, thy prime of manhood daring, bold, and venturous, thy age confirmed, proud, subdued, bloody, treacherous." Might not be the most flattering thing that anyone has ever said about their very beloved dissertation director, but it really is a compliment. To explain why, I do need to tell you some stories. Whenever it was that I first met Richard, and it must have been, give or take, 20 years ago, which hardly seems possible, but it must have been, I remember that in classic University of Chicago style, the meeting involved thoroughly indifferent sherry and excellent conversation. Richard and I talked extensively about John Donne, and then we moved on to the really serious stuff. New York and baseball. Discovering that I had some New York connections and that my father had grown up in Brooklyn. Do you remember this conversation, Richard? Richard mentioned that he had grown up in the Bronx. At that point, I pulled back in a certain amount of horror, some of it feigned, most of it not, and I asked, as I always do on such occasions, wait a minute. Does that mean you're a Yankee fan? For a second-generation Cleveland girl with a Brooklyn dad, this is not a trivial question. Happily, Richard dismissed that accusation with great scorn and told me that from the time he was a small child, he invested an enormous amount of time and energy into persuading the adults in his life to take him all of the way across town on the subway to Ebbets Field to see real baseball. Dodgers baseball. The Yankees, a plague on them. Tetchy and wayward indeed. And I knew I had found a kindred spirit and a fellow traveler. The longer and better that I knew Richard, the greater sense I had that the orneriness that put a Bronx kid on the subway to Brooklyn to watch a real ball game was an orneriness that drove Richard's approach to his work. This is a man who suggested to me that the only way to really understand Shakespeare's Richard III was to read it as a comedy. A man who argues that formalism is a dirty word, but we can't do without it. A man whose books have titles like Resistant Structures, Unrepentant, Renaissance, Tetchy and wayward, all the way down. So what does it mean then to be Richard's student? It means I learned to love Richard's touchy waywardness and my own. It means that I got used to sitting in his office in Gates Blake and hearing writing advice that sounded like this. Sarah, you finally got around to what you actually want to say right about here in the last sentence of the conclusion. So what I think you ought to do is take this home, start there, and write the whole thing again. It means that I got a piece of research advice from Richard that I still use every time I start any kind of project. find something in the text that annoys you and figure it out. It means that I still remember in very precise detail the day when I got a paper back from Richard that said, "Sarah, you have the seeds of something publishable." In fact, I still have the paper. I was going to bring it, but the next comment in the paper is, "Sarah, you really need to learn how to use your commas correctly," so I decided I'd leave that one at home. And it means that the dissertation topic that came out of that paper, representations of illness in early modern literature, cheerfully, waywardly, tetchily, unrepentantly bulldozed its way across every disciplinary boundary that it could find. I learned that from Richard, too. It means that the current work that I do, the stuff that people read, work on the economics of Charles Dickens, a short piece that I did on Shakespeare's Henry V and public choice, which refers to the opening wrangle between the churchmen and Henry V as hot, uncensored public choice action. The work that I do on hidden references to Shakespeare in Adam Smith's economics, all share that same bulldozing through boundaries that people think ought to be there. It also means, Eric, and I added this just now just for you, that I've recently started a Tumblr, which is titled Shit Shakespeare Didn't Say, which was spurred by a hunt I was doing for a quotation of Shakespeare's, and I came across on Goodreads a reference claiming that Shakespeare had said, "A friend is one that knows you as you are, understands where you have been, accepts what you have become, and still gently allows you to grow." Clearly, it was Richard's great training in close textual reading and in developing a sense of the language of the period that allowed me to instantly identify that as indeed shit that Shakespeare did not say. From small acorns, great oaks. I learned from Richard that you have to get over being in awe of writers like Shakespeare and Donne and Herbert and learn to think about them instead. I learned that a good baseball reference done to Herbert Devon, anyone? Never goes amiss. And I learned that there's absolutely no reason to think that good textual reading skills can't be put to use on 17th century surgical textbooks or on medical advertisements, or as I do most often these days, on economics. In fact, the last two things I did before I left my office to drive from Indiana for this symposium were both fruits of lessons that I have had from Richard. The first thing I did was write a column for the libertarian magazine The Freeman about the economics of Shakespeare's sonnet number 4. This is part of my continuing, possibly futile, certainly wayward, and very often tetchy effort to persuade free market economists that literature is A, not intrinsically biased against them, and B, it is also worth their time. It is useful, by the way, Richard, to be able to quote your latest book at them on that very topic. And the last thing I did was send a note to an editor of mine who had accepted an article pitch. "Dear Max, I'm so glad you're interested. Please let me know the target word count. If it's too long, I'll just follow my dissertation director's advice and take out all the adverbs." Thank you, Richard.
It's a terrible thing to have so many students who have so little personality, you know? Kind of dry, withdrawn, timid, shy. It's just terrible. I don't know how. It's just very disturbing. Well, I'm glad to be back that I'm being praised for orneriness. That being praised for mildness really just threw me off. But again, I mean, working with Sarah was a great, a really wonderful experience because I was just beginning to understand the presence, the importance of women in the 17th century poetry canon, and the poet that we really worked on together, Anne Collins, I think is a really major poet who I've taught forever since. But I think that Sarah's dissertation really moved that along. And since I got to say something about a sort of career failure in my last little, whatever this is, commentary, I want to say that a career success is the idea that non-literary texts can be read just as carefully with attention to rhetorical and other details as literary texts. And I'm very glad that Sarah is maintaining that line as well, because I actually think a few historians have come to believe this as well, but it's kind of a hard road to row there, but we're getting there. Anyhow, thank you, Sarah.
Next speaker is Glenn Clark. Glenn is from the University of Manitoba, and his talk is on emotion, conscience, and disobedience in King Lear and elsewhere.
Well, hello, everyone. Yes, this is among the larger and more impressive audiences I've had in some time, I think. So, Richard, if you felt up to retiring maybe 2 or 3 more times, yeah, it'll work for me. But we know you'll stay with us, one way or another. Right. My relationship with Richard began more than 20 years ago. I think it was spring 1991. I don't think you'll remember this, Richard. With a conversation about Gerard Winstanley during a discussion section of the Theatrical City course, co-taught by David Smith from Cambridge, David Bevington, and Richard. I'm afraid I now have little memory of the details of that conversation, but I do remember that I was immediately taken, not only by Richard's evident excitement about the topic, but also by what I recognized to be a deep and committed interest in an area of literary historical scholarship, to which I also felt drawn, the early modern literature and experience of resistance and dissent. I'm sure that I could not then have apprehended what Richard has since, in many ways, taught me to understand, that resistance, dissent, and disobedience are often founded in feeling, in emotion, passion, or conscience. I could not then have fully grasped what Richard has since, again in many ways, taught me to understand. That to really gain insight into a play's or a poem's capacity to capture emotion and to give force to its allegiances and disaffections, it is essential to attend carefully to formal detail and resonance. And certainly, it was Richard who enabled me, a Canadian lad so insistently secular, and maybe just a little bit timid as well, Richard, so insistently secular that I could not imagine approaching Renaissance literature through its religious contexts to develop the kind of neutral scholarly sympathy towards spiritual experience that I now think very nearly essential to compelling critical work in Renaissance literature. In order to share the impact of Richard's vision, and a vision it really is, on my humble critical output, I found it easiest to begin by trying to describe what I think of when I think of the conceptual trajectory of Richard's major publications. And I apologize for this. I do know I do this more for my own sense of coherence than for your edification. I realize we're all familiar with Richard's CV. At the core of Love Known, I'd say, is the argument that in Herbert's reformed thought and poetry, the divinely privileged space of the heart is not reasonable or decorous, but is passionate, unconstrained, and sincere, and must be so to be privileged. The Herbert Richard loves is unexpectedly indecorous, and so for Richard, the church porch, of course, is in need of transcendence. Richard has always been committed to demonstrating the unexpectedness and surprisingness of good literature. And such unexpectedness comes to be the central topic of resistant structures, with its inspired insistence that what we get in Herbert or Donne or Shakespeare, now listen for the complexity, what we get is what we get, even if it's so unorthodox as to be impossible. I hope Richard won't be displeased to learn that I first understood this argument in the terms of the other thing I became during my years in Chicago, Sarah, a Cubs fan. First and foremost, we need to call him as we see him. And Richard, I too thank you for your appreciation for and your willingness to accept all of your students' worldly as well as literary loves and desires. I can hardly explain how influential resistance structures was and has continued to be on my critical perspective. From the important opening chapters critiquing the predictability imposed by the frequent failure of theory to escape schematization, to the chapters on poetry and drama which demonstrate inductive critical richness, every part of this book has shaped me as a scholar. But the chapter which had the most impact on me was that on King Lear, which many of us had known earlier as faithful servants, Shakespeare's praise of disobedience. I'd like you to know this, Richard. Over the years I've been teaching Shakespeare, no moment has gone so consistently well in class as that in which we discuss Cornwall's conscientiously disobedient and treasonous servant. With full attention to the ways in which Shakespeare produces that scene's explosive emotions of contempt and anger. My classes become, and this is due to you, my classes become fully ready to grasp exactly what you write. Shakespeare is presenting the most radical possible socio-political act in a way that can only be interpreted as calling for his audience's approval. I thank you, Richard, for teaching me to look for moments of passionately driven insubordination and for the places and situations that put pressure on decorum. This is still the core of what makes Renaissance literature exciting for me. I was naturally absolutely delighted to see the expansion of Richard's vision of an excitingly indecorous and frequently unorthodox Renaissance world in the unrepentant Renaissance. This, to my mind, is the most compelling critique of our critical culture's oddly excessive faith in the explanatory force of the discourse subject text triad that I know of. Richard dares to speak of unashamed individuals whose works contest the judgment and morality we expect to be entirely dominant, and whose works privilege appetite and desire and other bodily and worldly urges. We return in part to the extraordinarily important fact of the Reformation critique of Stoicism we found in Loveknown's Herbert. Richard even gives us a Milton who values pride. This is amazing. Once again, Richard has renewed my excitement about Renaissance literature and reminded me never to ignore the contradictions, crudities, and crippling ambiguities, that's a quote from Richard, that actually allow for the energies within the experience of what would otherwise be enervating orthodoxy. I'll try briefly to point to a few places where I can see the influence of Richard's vision on my own work. I sometimes wonder if Richard perceived, before I did, his influence on my dissertation. Still, I assure him, a book in progress, in which dramatized taverns become places of powerfully expressed, unorthodox and indecorous emotion and transformative plain-spokenness. Surely, one would have thought, it is impossible that taverns might be likenable to churches, or be imagined as places of serious ethical conversation and fellowship. One offshoot of my work on taverns and civil conversation that I'm quite proud of is an article on civility in Romeo and Juliet, in which I argue that the disaffected, indecorous, and insubordinate feelings insistently thematized in the play open up a conceptual space for cross-status affection and citizenship, though a citizenship marked by the experience of contradiction expressed through paradox. Surprisingly indecorous disaffection for orthodoxy also holds an important place in my current primary book project on the ministry in Tudor Stuart drama. I examine the deeply ambivalent orientation towards social distinction, surely one of Herbert's characteristics, among both nonconformist and conformist ministers, as a context for a drama which comes to make surprisingly frequent use of preacherly characters who promote dissent and unorthodoxy while remaining unable to fully disengage themselves from the appeal of social distinction. This is very much a study of emotionally and conscientiously motivated resistance and of preacherly dependence upon passion, and a study whose context draws on one of Richard's favored historical plots, that of the spiritualization of the laity, or the folding of the religious into the secular, as Richard once put it. And of course, here I am also influenced by Richard's vision of historical formalism, which means both the reading of formal details in historical documents and the historicization of form in literary art. Indeed, Richard's seminal historical formalist essay, From Diagnosis to Operation in the Theatrical City, a volume, I should say, whose interdisciplinary conversations among literary scholars and historians influenced the conceptualization of my co-edited collection, City Limits, Perspectives on the Historical European City. And I thank David, if David's here too. I thank David for the Theatrical City as well. At any rate, From Diagnosis to Operation has directly influenced me. Without Richard's recognition of the thematization of love for Parliament in the Grand Remonstrance, I do not think I would have been inspired to see the subtle, non-programmatic republicanism in Massinger's The City Madam, on which I've recently published. Surely it should be impossible to find republicanism in a conservative, Johnsonian city satire. I'll always feel the force of Richard's hesitation to allow textual detail to be flattened by the perception of orthodox hegemony, a hesitation, a dissent that has characterized Richard's career-long vision, but was beautifully expressed almost 25 years ago in his inspiring, literally inspiring essay, John Donne, Awry and Squint. To quote Richard, "What then do we gain by seeing the holy sonnets in their proper biographical context, and without historical preconceptions, or aesthetic preconceptions about the necessary greatness of these poems? I would argue that to read the poems in this context, and without these preconceptions, allows us to see their actual peculiar shapes more clearly. We do not have to fit them into any predetermined mold, aesthetic or theological. This freedom from constraining theories should help us make better use of all the poems as human documents." I can say nothing better, so I end there. Thanks, Richard.
Glenn was a wonderful student, just a wonderful student. And unlike some of your speakers, Eric, Sarah being obvious cases, he's someone who did need to be told that he could do it, that he really was in the right place. It wasn't someone gifted with Miltonic pride and self-assurance, but was rather too much on the other end of things, on a kind of self-humbling that might not have been productive. But I'm happy to say that I had some effect in getting Glenn to believe, what's obviously true, that he really does have a contribution to make to our field. And of course, you can already hear that he's making it. And Glenn was a remarkably sympathetic student in the sense of just our interests seemed to sort of just map onto it. The way politics and religion sort of struck us as working in the period was just remarkably compatible. And something that's come up, that came up in Chris Hodgkins's talk and came up again in Glenn's, I think is something that I'm quite proud of and have sometimes in context been asked to reflect upon it. How can someone who has no obvious or hidden religious commitment write so much and care so much about Reformation and early modern theology in general? And sometimes it's asked as a challenge, but mostly it's asked as a genuine question. I mean, sometimes, like when I do this at yeshiva and whatnot, I'm asked, what's a nice Jewish boy like you studying George Herbert? And it's a reasonable question, but I think it's very important for what education is, that you don't have to be one to know one, and that you can enter deeply and sympathetically into a thought world that you don't share, but a thought world whose values you can understand. And this is something that I think Glenn very eloquently mentioned, and Chris alluded to, and that I think is really quite important for what education is. And I think if that's something that I stand for, the possibility of entering into thought worlds that really are not your own, so that when people, after I come talk to Lutherans about Luther, come tell me, surely you're one of us. And I say, no, I think this is really wonderful stuff, but for me it's an object of study. I think that's really important for whatever education is. Thanks.
Our next speaker is Alicia Tomasian, who got her PhD here in 2005. She now teaches at the William Rainey Harper College, and her title is, Well, I Will Not Altogether Despair, Pamphlets, Parleys, and the Development of a Dissertation Topic.
Let me preface by saying that among groups less familiar with the rise of New Historicism, I would set this entire story 10 years later, as I think with the proper lighting I might be able to get away with the age adjustment, and Richard certainly can. But alas, you all can probably assume that the course at the center of my narrative, Richard's graduate seminar on New Historicism, probably occurred sometime in the mid-1990s. I had just survived what would turn out to be one of the last brutal MA cuts, and I had spent the year trudging through my coursework while floundering. Potential dissertation topics included ideas with the laser focus of the body. I remember trying to formulate something like a proposal and handing it to Janelle Mueller, who generously called it a think piece. I had done some interesting work on John Lilly, which I really had enjoyed, but when I thought about the long run of a dissertation, it just didn't feel like me. Then I signed up for Richard's graduate seminar on New Historicism, which quickly became the cozy, somewhat snarky group making up much of what was then the department's Team Renaissance. The class quickly earned the subtitle, Reading Richard's Friends, and most of us took on assigned class roles, much like a hockey team's offense. I am quite certain Richard wanted it that way, and it produced what turned out to be the electrified, provocative atmosphere that forever changed my graduate experience. We read Greenblatt, of course, Richard's friend Stephen. I remember the class questioning the idea of friction until Richard, laughing, exclaimed, I know, it's called flirting. In true Stryer fashion, the class became one in which we all joyfully took turns playing devil's advocate, although I perhaps took more than a few turns. This was made difficult by the fact that I usually agree with Richard's readings, but the result was always worth it. The apex came on the day Richard had assigned his book, Love Known, and Schoenfeld's book on Herbert, Prayer and Power. Let me preface by saying that I adored Love Known.
Michael Schoenfeld is in the room right here.
As I'm going to reference in a minute. Let me preface by saying that I adored Love Known, but I also adored Prayer and Power. And I went in on that day determined to defend the man who was not in the room, but is today, Michael Schoenfeld. I remember saying something like, why can't all this language of impotence be referring to sexuality? Richard loved it. In true Stryer fashion, he engaged me in an extended discussion that turned into an amazing class. He taught us all the joy of debate, and after that, I was certain I wanted to work with him. But it was the subject matter of the seminar that finally produced the work. As much as we enjoyed picking apart every essay we read, I was thoroughly charmed with the variety of archival sources the authors referenced. It was this course that prompted me to start reading pamphlets, trials, ballads. I hungrily spun through microfilm and dusty volumes of collected miscellany, increasingly becoming enamored with crime stories featuring women. Finally, my dissertation topic came out of that seminar. By the end of a short 10 weeks, I was obsessed with criminal women and the performance of their stories on stage. It made me a new historicist, although years later, Richard would affectionately tell me, "You're crazy, you're old historicist." Looking back, I'm so grateful for the gift of that excitement of discovery, for finding a topic that felt so much like me. In fact, I became so enmeshed with one of my con artists, Alice West, that I began typing her name as Alicia. Although I've never been arrested, I should say. But I'm perhaps equally grateful that Richard learned the ways that I was crazy and gave just the right amount of direction to curb it. When I was researching my chapter on the Roaring Girl, I went a little old historicist crazy. I was convinced I could find a connection between one of the gentlemen with whom Mary Frith was reported to have conspired in her Star Chamber case and Thomas Middleton. I started doing things like reading years of residence lists of Middle Temple. I became, well, obsessed. At one point, Richard said, "No more library. I'm banning you from the library. Go home and write the chapter." I tried to protest, but he repeated, "Home! Write the chapter!" A week later, I ran into him in the library. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. I tried to make up some weak excuse about stopping in to use the ladies' room, but he was not fooled. "Home," he ordered me. "Write the chapter." At times, however, he let us win just the right battles. My first conference paper, presented at the 16th Century Studies Conference, was on Every Man Out of His Humor, the play from which my title comes today. Frustrated citizen's wife Falace, obsessed with courtier fastidious brisk, sighs, "Well, I will not altogether despair. I've heard of other citizens' wives beloved of a courtier, and why not I?" After which she resolved to lock herself in her privy chamber and think on his good parts, one after another. In one of her early encomiums of Brisk, she catalogs his excellent body parts and gestures. I had written in the paper that we could almost imagine her admiring his ass. Richard said, "Don't say ass at 16th Century Studies." "How else can I say it?" I asked. He came up with a few suggestions. Behind, derriere, posterior. But I wasn't satisfied. On the day, I believe I said, "his fabulous ass." But as I read it, Richard smiled, pleased. Later he told me, "That was right. You said it just the way you would say it. I'm glad you said ass." Of course, more important than winning or losing the battle was always the battle itself and the work that came out of it. Richard took forever to sign my proposal, for example, because he kept rejecting my titles. He would look at one, shake his head, and say something like, "It just doesn't capture the project." I was trying desperately to get it approved so I could travel to London. Finally, I chased him down on the quad, sweating and holding forth the paper that undoubtedly held another rejection. He looked at it, raised his eyebrows, thought about it, and finally said, "Okay." At my oral exams, I vividly remember him asking me to produce a reading of Twelfth Night as a triumph of heterosexuality. "I don't believe that," I responded. "I know," he retorted. "That's why I want you to do it." Which leads to one of the most important lessons Richard taught me. Of course, he taught me so much about being a scholar and a teacher. But behind all of this is this: whatever you do, do it with style. Either side of an argument can be provocative and worthwhile as long as you own it. Bring your own persona to your classroom and let your students do the same. Is it any wonder that he can illuminate an unrepentant Renaissance? He taught all of us to be unrepentant. Richard brings this sense of style to all aspects of his life. He taught me that it is just worth it to drink better wine. I remember how pleased he was the year that I announced that my New Year's resolution was to drink more red wine. I once told him jokingly that my motto is that it is better to look good than to feel good. To which he responded, "There's no difference." For years, I assisted with the Renaissance Seminar, a group of Chicagoland faculty. I would help serve dinner and clean up. On one occasion, I accidentally left a bottle of detergent on the dining table that then became the podium for the talk. At the end of the talk, Richard pointed to the bottle. "Was that there the whole time?" he asked. I admitted that I thought it had been. He cringed and said, "How déclassé." He even allowed us to be unrepentant on the brutally unforgiving job market. With unimaginable patience, Richard would read through my melodramatic, novella-length emails describing my various traumas. Once on a campus visit, I offered my condolences to a member of the department whose family had just been displaced as a result of Hurricane Katrina. As I put my hand on her arm, telling her how sorry I was, she started to cry. At the dinner! In my 3-page account of the visit, I kept returning to it. I made her cry. I think the talk was okay. Nobody cried at the talk. Most of it was fine when nobody was crying. Richard shrugged it off. "You showed you're a human being," he assured me. "That's a good thing." And I think that's the point on which I would like to end. That there's no point in being a scholar of the humanities if you aren't also human. We do this because we love the work, love the classroom, love working with our students. I was shocked when I heard Richard was retiring, but he explained, "This way I still get to do all the parts of the job I love. I still get to write, teach, direct dissertations. It makes sense." We all could tell that Richard loved working with his graduate students. He made it fun, always made us feel like we were human beings, even though we were graduate students at the University of Chicago. Without that, would any of us have made it through? So thank you.
So I wish I could take credit for Alicia, but I can't. The credit for Alicia goes to someone who I deeply love and have known for a very long time, even longer than I've known Alicia. My friend and former colleague, Marty Andrucki, who is the director of the drama program at Bates College in Maine, where Alicia attended and was a dramatic star. And Marty is someone who knows drama when he sees it, and clearly encouraged Alicia to be the shrinking violet that you saw before you. So I wish I could take credit for it, but really it really goes to Marty Andrucki, who is also the mentor of Jeffrey and Robin's budding young theatrical person. I don't know. We might have to have some sort of contest at the end of the day of which is my funniest graduate student. This is a tough one, but and I'm really glad you said ass. I can't believe that I told you not to, but I was young and foolish also. But the New Historicism seminar really was quite important and was a great thing, very feisty indeed. But the one thing that I want to say about it is that there were, I think, 11 or 12 students in the seminar, all very serious, potential Renaissance scholars. And I'd offered everyone the opportunity of either writing about New Historicism, theory or practice, or doing a piece of New Historicism. Well, 11 out of 12 people wrote about New Historicism. Alicia is the one who actually did some New Historicism. And as she said, it became her dissertation. So it really was a case of someone. Now, I was hoping that there would be more work like that, but that was the one piece that emerged out of that seminar. And as I'm happy to say with so many of my other students, Alicia has become a good friend as well as a valuable colleague in Renaissance studies.
Next up is Marie-Teresa O'Connor, who got her PhD in 2009. She's at the Johns Hopkins University now. And her title is Immaterial Britain, King James VI and First, and King Lear.
It is a great honor and delight to be here today to celebrate Richard. It is truly wonderful to have the chance to express my gratitude for having had the best advisor that I can imagine. Since the organizers have asked us to highlight Richard's contributions to our scholarly lives, I'm going to spend the first part of my talk briefly introducing myself and my work. Then I'll talk about just what a great and greatly appreciated contribution Richard has made to that work and to my sense of myself as a scholar. I came to Renaissance literature after having practiced law for several years. I went to law school here at the University of Chicago and then practiced international and corporate law, first in Budapest and then in New York, before coming back to Chicago for graduate school. In fact, it wasn't even my intention when I left law to focus on the Renaissance, but more on that later. My current research interests include law, Shakespeare, and political and economic thought. I'm currently working on a book project that focuses on Shakespeare and King James VI and I's controversial project to unite Scotland and England to Britain. My interest is in the ambiguity that the Union issue created over what exists, whether Scotland and England or a newly formed Britain. In particular, my objective is to delve into the effects of James's having asked his subjects to regard something immaterial, namely Britain, as superior to what actually legally and institutionally existed. I seek to show that despite especially English Union opponents' denials, James's vision of a divinely formed Britain acquired a quasi-presence within Union discourse. One of my aims is to show that James's association of his person and title with Britain had decentering effects, positioning him in passive relation to his subjects as part of an allegedly immaterial realm over there that was open to their active interpretation, and also in ambiguous relation to Scotland and England. My further aim is to show that attending to these effects gives insight into Shakespeare's imaginative focus on Britain at this time. For instance, whereas King Lear's division of the kingdoms is commonly seen as offering a reverse complement to James's union, my suggestion is that the play may be seen as holding up a mirror to James. The play, I suggest, dramatizes the vulnerabilities of James's immaterial British kingship, but also the possibilities for interpretive agency that it may have afforded to his subjects, including in relation to allegiance, citizenship, and the distribution of material resources. So where does Richard come into this? Well, he's present at every stage. When I returned to the University of Chicago to study English literature after practicing law, I quite frankly did not know what I was doing. It felt like a sharp break in my life, from one sense of self and identity to another. My plan was to study the Victorian novel, and I was fumbling to figure out whether there was a connection between who I was and what I had embarked upon. I enrolled in Richard's Lear seminar for really no better reason than loving the play, which I still do. The class had the utterly unexpected and wonderful effect of showing me the continuity in my own life and interests, since precisely what I loved about legal and political thought, in particular how they relate to imagination, the emotions, to citizenship, belonging, and connectedness, emerged as precisely what I could pursue and wonder about. Richard's class taught me that I had in effect made a much wiser and happier decision than I had known. Rather than leaving something behind, I discovered the deep, rich connections between the worlds of imagination and of law and politics, and the joyfulness of being able to explore them. That first extraordinary seminar that I took with Richard also introduced me to the puzzles that continue to fascinate, perplex, and pull me along. I remember when, in the first or second class, Richard was figuring out who would do what presentation, and he asked whether I would like to do political Shakespeare, the division of the kingdom. And there, in effect, was the start of my dissertation. My dissertation, though, then took a long, winding path through the archive of documents on the Union: letters, speeches, treatises, proclamations, legal arguments, poems, masques, progresses. My starting point was, as might be imagined, James's political thought, in particular for me, his distinction between Britain's divine formation and an inclusive, pragmatic process of what James called perfecting it. But, as happens, my research also turned in unexpected ways, focusing, for example, on how the Union issue generated a dynamic context for thinking about redistribution, and I argue gave rise to a Republican-inflected account of self-interest. Richard was unfailingly supportive and curious about digressions, and incredibly generous in helping one see how they might not in fact be digressions. He was also never dismayed at how immersed I became in the broad Union archive, or how long it took me to come back to the plays. Richard conveys a sense of confidence in his students that allows room for becoming perplexed and following leads and queries that might not seem relevant or are outside the critical conversation that one seems to be in. As Richard's student, I have felt a powerful kinship between his brilliant, generous, and open-minded approach to texts and his approach to teaching and advising. Richard manages somehow to give his students the extraordinary benefit of his sage guidance and his acute critical eye, without ever conveying any sense of limitation or restriction on what one might think or pursue. And even though I have gotten my degree, I have never stopped thinking about Richard as my advisor. For one thing, as all of you probably know, Richard gives extraordinarily good advice. I have ever been grateful for Richard's bringing together of sympathetic pragmatism with a sense that much more might be possible than one might think. As a teacher, I have sought utterly imperfectly to emulate Richard's skill and energy in the classroom. I remember classes of Richard's that were nothing less than a tour de force, where the students left abuzz with intellectual delight and revelation. What was so incredibly admirable was that Richard accomplished this not as performance, but by guiding and shaping a sustained and highly participatory close reading with us, in which we were all doing what was in effect learning how to read. As a scholar, I have sought to keep hold of that coupling of intellectual freedom with rigor that Richard models, a coupling that enables a reader's greatest strength, the capacity and ability to be surprised by what one might find and learn. Thank you so much, Richard.
Well, as everyone knows, I'm a great fan of the Aristotelian virtue of proper pride, one of the great Greek virtues that Christianity has a hard time accommodating. Even Thomas Aquinas couldn't quite manage to get it reconciled with humility. And it's interesting to me that as I sort of hear these presentations and think about my students, there really are two groups. The students who had this all along and just sort of needed to have that recognized, and the students who needed a little boost of proper pride. And Marissa was in that category, that like Glenn, she didn't know how good she was. And I feel very privileged in being able to help her realize her own powers and develop proper pride. And I'm happy to say that she has a wonderful essay in the Shakespeare and Law volume. So again, I mean, it was a case of helping someone find a voice, but also the more I sort of hear these presentations, I think successes with students come through a kind of intellectual, deep intellectual sympathy that somehow, as with so many of the other people who've talked, that these are people with whom I shared a deep intellectual sympathy, so that it wasn't a matter of teaching so much as sort of recognizing a topic or field of common interest and sort of working on it together. And I very much had that feeling with Marissa. And Marissa's story is especially interesting to me because she went to law school with my wife, who was leaving academia to become a lawyer, and their careers parallel each other in opposite ways. But both of them, I think, have a sense of the odd consistency of what looked like two separate careers. So thanks, Marissa.
Our next speaker is Jeff Ruffo. Got his PhD here in 2009. Jeff is at Trinity University at the moment, but he's moving on his way to Rutgers. And the title of Jeff's talk is "He's But a Sot as I Am, Seizing Stryer's Books."
Thanks again to Eric and everyone here for this. It's a lot of fun. So he's but a sot as I am, seizing Stryer's books. Like several of my friends and colleagues here today, I've borrowed a quotation for the title of my talk. Mine is surely recognizable. The line is from Shakespeare's The Tempest and is delivered by Caliban in reference to Prospero. There are a few reasons for my choice, not least of which is the fact that The Tempest is a play that both Richard and I have both been thinking and writing a lot about in recent months. We were in attendance at the most recent SAA seminar on The Tempest, along with the Vaughns, Virginia and Alden, and Marion Novi, and some other people, and it was a lot of fun. Then, of course, there's the obvious connection to make on this occasion. The play is largely about retirement. But in what follows, I thought it'd be fun to explore what Caliban means precisely when he says that Prospero would be merely a sot, meaning a fool and or a drunkard, without his books. Before getting started, though, I'd like to state for the record that I actually never took a course with Richard, and I did not receive my degree in English. I'm a comparatist. I received mine in Complet as well. So. This was perhaps my first Caliban-like, which is to say futile, attempt at resistance. When I was a graduate student, it was difficult, if not impossible, to study Renaissance literature at Chicago and to avoid Richard Strier. Not that I ever wanted to, of course. I first got to know Richard, like so many of my peers, through the Renaissance workshop, where I came to respect his wide range of intellectual interests, as well as his love of debate and argument. After vetting my work and chatting during office hours, he eventually signed on as first reader for my dissertation, which was on French politics in the English history play, a project that was directed by David Bevington. It's no coincidence that at this time we also started playing tennis together. Needless to say, he was, like Prospero, a stern master in both the intellectual and physical arenas, although in the end I do think that it's fair to say he took more pity on me in the seminar room than on the tennis court. It was Richard who made me read critics like John Pocock, Quentin Skinner, Patrick Collinson, Victoria Kahn, and Hans Baron. Without his encouragement to seize and study the books by these and other authors, including himself, I honestly believe that I would not be where I am today. Whether or not this is a good thing, I leave for you to judge. Now, to return to the quotation of the title of my talk, what exactly am I implying by citing this pivotal moment in Act 3, Scene 2 of The Tempest, with its vision of a sottish, disempowered Prospero? Not that I'm anything like the incorrigible, murderous, mooncalf Caliban, or that Richard can or should be thought of as a taskmaster and a tyrant. Despite my many losses on the tennis court to this man, I never wanted to brain him, to find a new master, to become someone else's new man. It never occurred to me, as a long-suffering graduate student, to act defiantly or to rebel in the way that Caliban does. But what if it had? To frame the question in terms of this play, what does it mean that Caliban's plan to overthrow Prospero turns specifically upon the ability of the drunken band of upstarts to seize his books? What would an idiotic, enfeebled, or inebriated Prospero look like? In order to begin thinking through these questions, let's take a look at what Richard has to say about education in The Tempest. In his paper for this year's SAA meeting, entitled Punishment versus Prudence, The Tempest and the Humanist Tradition, Stryer persuasively reads Prospero as a humanist pedagogue. He argues that The Tempest is deeply immersed in an early modern conversation about the role of education in society, and that it engages with the humanist tradition in a direct and sustained way. The final two paragraphs of the essay capture the gist of the essay, and I'll read an abbreviated version right now. So, the vision of cultivation that the play presents is the more chilling one that Mary Thomas Crane has seen in humanist pedagogy, rather than the more generous one for which Rebecca Bushnell argues. The play is within the generous humanist tradition. However, in the depth of its critique of the punitive, it does succeed, I think, in maintaining a distinction between the prudent and the punitive. It retains some faith in the educational project and in the possibility of controlling sexuality, but it has much less faith in the project of transforming adults and in control of that much more dangerous lust, the libido dominandi, the desire for power, which Prospero and his brother largely share. Here I would agree that The Tempest is at once both hopeful and skeptical about the capacity of education to encourage individual reform. According to the play, a lot depends on the student, and there's truth to the implied notion that it is harder to teach an old dog new tricks. Moreover, there are limits to the kind of positive effects a teacher or mentor can have on an unregenerate pupil. It seems clear to me that Ferdinand, like Ariel, contrasts with Caliban in his receptivity to a moral education. And while Miranda is never punished, she is dominated by her father in ways that modern feminist critics, me included, find unsettling. Stryer's claim that Prospero, like his usurping brother Antonio, is lustful for power, is supported by the play in the end. Shakespeare's critique of the punitive tracks nicely with the play's movement away from revenge and strife and towards mercy and reconciliation. In this reading of the play, Prospero must continue learning and working in order to become and to be the best teacher, father, and philosopher king he can be. It is not entirely clear that Shakespeare requires us to feel that he achieves this goal in the action depicted in the play. We, the audience, must choose, finally, whether or not Prospero is worthy of a return to Milan. We need not like Prospero in the end, but we should respect, if not fear him, as Aimé Césaire says in one of Richard's favorite adaptations of The Tempest, he is power. So, where's my intervention here? I want to suggest that I think we can and should push Richard's reading even further here. He ignores a compelling piece of evidence that would bolster his already persuasive argument, which involves the peculiar strategy or mode of insurrection proposed by Caliban. Addressing his new masters, Stefano and Trinculo, Caliban says, "'Tis a custom with him in the afternoon to sleep. There thou mayst brain him, having first seized his books. Or with a log batter his skull, or paunch him with a stake, or cut his weasand with thy knife." Can never get that. "Remember first to possess his books, for without him he's but a sot, as I am. Nor hath not one spirit to command. They all do hate him as rootedly as I. Burn but his books." Caliban's vision of assassination is gruesome. The verbs brain, batter, paunch, and cut are subversive, graphic, and for the actor delivering the lines, quite delightful. Charged with a bloodlust that makes Caliban seem less like the cold and calculating Machiavel than a passionate revenger in the vein of Laertes, Andronicus, or Hieronymo. What is particularly interesting here, though, is that Prospero's books act not as a weapon or tool of oppression even, but as a shield or a protective device against physical acts of violence. The words Caliban employs are seizing, possessing, verbs that might seem incongruous when it comes to the source of Prospero's power, books, which surely must be the source of knowledge. Seizure and possession are words that are more frequently used by Shakespeare and in early modern English to describe the acquisition of land, or else other types of legal procurement, often showing up in discourses on enclosure and actions by the state. Of course, the more generic usage is also applicable here. Caliban only means to say that Stefano and Trinculo must take, steal, or remove Prospero's books, whatever they are exactly. The consequence of being a sot for Prospero is that he will have nary a spirit to command, no loyal subjects, only rebels. So, finally, I guess what I'm suggesting here is that we can and should read Caliban's particular form of resistance, not just as a political rebellion or a coup d'etat, but as particularly anarchic, in the sense that it spits in the face of the civilizing influence of a liberal or humanist education that Richard describes in his essay. Caliban does not simply reject Prospero's earlier attempts at teaching him, or resent him for a linguistic legacy. Instead, Shakespeare is here suggesting that Caliban's resistance to cultivation is somehow commensurate with a destructive impulse towards the material stuff of education itself. Ultimately, seizing Prospero's books is politically as opposed to economically radical, in the sense that Caliban's is a desire to level the playing field, not to acquire what the master already owns. Whatever these books are, Caliban has no interest in reading them, and perhaps this is why he fails. So if I'm somewhat skeptical about the political ramifications of Prospero's pedagogy, I'm much less so about Richard's. I never needed to seize Stryer's books, because they were already readily available to me. This is, I think, Bushnell's generous humanist pedagogy, one that insists upon the value of the carrot over the stick. If Richard was a tyrant as a member of my committee, then he was certainly the benevolent dictator kind. Allow me to conclude with an anecdote to support this claim here. So one of Richard's favorite things to write on my chapter drafts and papers in general was the phrase, "You haven't earned this." This was in response to my poorly planned, reckless, and half-baked attacks upon professors, scholars, and critics with whom I disagreed. I think what he was trying to tell me then was that I wasn't doing myself any favors by trying to burn his books and those of a previous, more powerful generation. In the academy, much like on Prospero's Island, authority must be earned. And so, although I realize that Richard is entering a new phase of his career as a teacher and a scholar, not giving up his magic per se, nonetheless, I hope that I've earned the right to call myself not just his student, but also his friend and his colleague, his comrade in arts, if you will, whatever that art actually is. Thank you.
First of all, before I go any further, I want to correct an important misconception. I never beat Jeff at a singles match. I don't know if I could have, I doubt it, but we were mostly doubles partners. So I think there was a little bit of rewriting history for the purposes of drama in this presentation. Although which of my former graduate students is the best tennis player is another interesting question. We'd have to get Aaron Kitch and Jeff. And is Josh Adams here? I know he was for a while. Is he here? He was. Oh, he was. And Josh together, and they'd have to battle it out. And I'm not sure to whom I would give the palm or whatever. I'm really pleased that Jeff and Laura spoke as complet students, because again, it's one of those disciplinary divides that doesn't really make much sense. And just as I was happy to support Laura in studying Shakespeare in Latvia, about which I knew nothing, I was really happy to be involved with Jeff's attempt to bring English and French drama of the 17th century together, which has oddly not been done very much, and to encourage particularly the French side of the project. And I'm happy to say that we're publishing an article of his in Modern Philology on this very topic. And I'm also pleased to have been associated with the idea of encouraging Jeff and other students to read non-literary scholars, to read especially political historians and thinkers of the sort that Skinner and Pocock are. Because again, I think that's a disciplinary divide that's unnecessary, and that I think Jeff's work was really amazingly transformed by his encounter, I think especially maybe with Collinson, really in a wonderful way. So it's wonderful to have students who, to mix metaphors, can not only serve, but take the ball and run with it to shift sports. Thank you.
While I had many anecdotes about my time that I spent with Richard, I had blocked them from my memory.
but then I found that while trying to write about my work to the extent that there is any, I found myself continually writing about Richard's work. I thought that this truth, in conjunction with the prior truth, might lead me in an interesting direction, and I'm glad that Jeffrey is here today. So, published in 1995, Resistance Structures was as much directed toward the Renaissance text of its title as it was against the predominant critical assumptions of the discipline at the time of its composition, most of which no longer hold as strongly as they did then. But despite this fact, and unlike its author whose retirement we celebrate today, Resistance Structures is far from being a dated piece of work. Its particular readings have proved to be major interventions in the scholarship of Donne and Shakespeare, but its introductory methodological points are even more significant, and I would say even more significant today for younger scholars. This is because, and Richard might disagree with this characterization, but this is because the metaphysical commitments underlying Richard's literary historical criticism are the minimal commitments without which the practice of criticism itself becomes impossible. Yet these commitments have often been denied, or have often seemed to have been denied, at the level of theory, even as they have been reaffirmed by and in the practices of those who deny them. One institutional consequence of this has been that the professionalization of graduate students in English and related fields sometimes includes, in addition to the development of the skills and knowledge required for humanistic scholarship and teaching, a habituated skepticism about concepts as fundamental to these practices as intentionality, facts, agency, persons, and truth. To his credit, Richard has always resisted this tendency in the discipline, and not merely because of his obstinacy. Not merely. His knowledge of and appreciation for the work of W.V.O. Quine, Donald Davidson, and Bernard Williams inured him against our discipline's somewhat extravagant reception of the post-Kantian philosophical tradition, and led him to the correct belief that a truly radical criticism, two of Richard's favorite words, truly and radical, must depend upon, rather than pretend to repudiate, concepts basic to any intelligible account of human thought and action. The first of these metaphysical commitments is a commitment to the irreducibility of intentionality as in part constitutive of meaning. As Richard puts it, the agent's conception of an action is neither irrelevant to it on the one hand, nor fully constitutive of it on the other. Now, despite the modesty of this claim, which is compatible with and presupposed by a wide variety of otherwise incompatible metaphysical positions, it was in 1995, and in some quarters remains today, controversial. For it is in fact antithetical to at least one influential reading of, for example, Foucault, who in his Archaeology of Knowledge is often taken to argue that the intentions of the person who judges in making some particular judgment are not even in part an independent source of the constitution of the discourse in which the subject participates. Now, Richard's commitment to the irreducibility of intentionality as in part constitutive of meaning is itself sufficient to allow for the possibility of what he calls resistant structures, facts and structures of and in particular texts which resist any attempt to totalize the meaning of those texts in advance. A totalizing interpretive strategy might be understood as a strategy that specifies in advance the relation between the person who judges and acts and the pre-existing linguistic and social conventions in and through which he or she judges and acts. The person is either totally collapsed into these conventions or is totally constrained by them. In either case, the person's intentions in judging or acting so and not otherwise are made irrelevant to the meaning or possible range of meanings, which itself has been totalized by the interpreter as a function of what pre-exists any individual person: conventions, genres, traditions, modes of production, historical context, discourses, and the like. Now, If it is possible that the structures of and in particular text resist such interpretive strategies, then it can only be because these resistance structures cannot be reduced to the pre-existing structures that purportedly explain them, but have to be attributed to an alternate and at least partially independent source, God. Or, if not God, then the intentions of the particular person behind the particular text in question. Now, the second metaphysical commitment of Richard is that the linguistically embodied intentions of a particular person are in principle recoverable by other linguistically competent persons. But because the time of written utterances differs from the time of the reception, the recoverability of intention embodied in the utterance presupposes a shared time between speaker and hearer or reader that is the now of neither considered separately. Alistair MacIntyre puts it thus: a piece of writing, whenever it confronts a reader, does so at a time which is not only now for that reader or hearer, but becomes the author's coincident now, no matter how long previously the work was written or spoken. In that shared time, exempted in some respects, although not in others, from the temporal separation of the now of the utterance from the now of reading or hearing, the timelessness extends to the standards of reason-giving, reason-accepting, and reason-rejecting, in the light of which alone the writer and reader can put each other to the question. Richard's exhortation that critics approach individual texts with as few presuppositions, theoretical and historical, as possible, can be heard as a defense of this shared time between writer and reader, a time in which they put each other to the question, against its usurpation by the present time of the reader alone, whose presuppositions about the time of the writer may prevent the reader from hearing what he or she has to say. And indeed, it has often been the case that historicizing a text functions not so much to acknowledge the text's temporal distance from the present as to totalize this distance as encompassing even the common time between writer and reader in which understanding takes place, if it ever does. These founding principles of Richard's critical practice are, I think, properly described as metaphysical ones, but they are not for this reason dogmatic, both because Richard is not the Pope and because, as Bernard Williams has shown, they are analytic to the spirit of truthfulness that must motivate any criticism. In Richard's work, these principles are, at least sometimes, put in the service of a particular politics, which I will call, again drawing on Williams, the politics of liberal critique. In his introduction, Richard's opening assertion that particular texts may prove cognitively resistant to general claims leads directly to his accounts of the political resistance of particulars during the first modern revolution, in which a king was formally brought to trial and executed for offenses against the people. Given this allusion to the execution of Charles, Richard's earlier admonition to critics reads like counsel offered a Renaissance prince. I do not wish critics to work less hard or to know less, but only to resist the final turn of the screw, the moment when resistance in the text is overcome rather than acknowledged. The sentence almost analogizes the totalizing critics' intellectual distortion of texts to the tyrannical ruler's political distortion of bodies, so that Richard's own interpretive practice comes to embody a free and liberal politics, while the putatively radical methods of theory embody the anti-politics of totalitarianism. This, of course, is intended to be taken, at least partly, in jest, I think. But its presence across the introduction to resistance structures nevertheless prompts two puzzles about the relation between Richard's own interpretive politics and the anti-politics of his rivals. The first puzzle has to do with deconstruction, which in one respect is the position most proximate to Richard's, insofar as it celebrates the resistance of particulars to theories. And yet, in another respect, deconstruction presents us with the purest and most totalizing theory on offer, precisely because its theorization of the resistance of particulars to theory demolishes the distinction between the particular and the theoretical altogether. In Richard's fable of interpretive politics, I want peevishly to ask, is deconstruction the equivalent of the scientific socialism of Soviet communism, or is it rather the equivalent of the economistic libertarianism that is the fulfillment or betrayal of an earlier liberal politics? Is Paul the Man more like Friedrich Engels or Robert Nozick? In either case, Richard's oppositional characterization of deconstruction leads directly to a second puzzle. Well, not really a puzzle so much as an observation, for it highlights Richard's commitment to a kind of intellectual or natural aristocracy that exists alongside and even within his commitment to liberalism. The first whiff of the aristocratic occurs on page 2 of the book, when Richard acknowledges in passing that not all literary texts will produce the bafflements that signal the resistance to totalizing schemes. Because Richard so closely ties text to the persons behind them, it seems at least tempting to conclude that, without totalizing Richard's account myself, while some persons really do possess the capacity for self-determination, it's not obvious, initially at least, that every person does. Some persons, administrators, baffle us only in their failure to baffle. So it would appear that an aristocratic self-regard or pride is in fact proper to the politics of Richard's own political, the criticism of his criticism. I really mangled that one. No wonder why he likes John Milton so much. Before I conclude, I want to pose one real question of Richard. Richard affirms that a certain skepticism about the cry of anachronism follows from his approach to the practice of literary criticism. This is because, with certain obvious exceptions, the question of what any particular text is doing or saying is always an empirical question, answerable finally, which is not to say only, on the basis of the facts and structures in and of the particular text itself. But it seems to me that a healthy skepticism about anachronism leads naturally to a healthy skepticism about periodization. For the concept of periodization depends upon our willingness to accept anachronism as a way of, at least provisionally, making sense of the qualitative difference between quantitative units of historical time. This is why much of the recent scholarship interrogating our inherited categories of periodization also involves an interrogation of the concept of anachronism as such. On the one hand, it seems to me that Richard's critical practice anticipates this current development in the scholarship. He was willing to risk the charge of anachronism long after it was respectable to do so, and long before it became respectable again. And this is but one of the ways in which Richard's critical work is like a man whose clothes are always out of fashion or in advance of fashion, but never actually fashionable. On the other hand, though, I sometimes think that Richard's skepticism about the obvious applicability of the concept of anachronism to particular readings of particular texts written during the Renaissance is paradoxically predicated on the stability and indeed the uniqueness of the Renaissance period itself. In an extremely interesting and perceptive footnote to his introduction, Richard observes that our choice between early modern and Renaissance as descriptors of the, let's call it, period, is a choice between historiographic myths, theirs or ours. Is this position the same position that Richard takes in his wonderfully provocative The Unrepentant Renaissance? For in that book, Richard's use of the phrase the Renaissance seems less a capitulation to their historiographical myth and more a defense of what Richard, following Burckhardt, takes to be a central, if not its only, truth about it. Like the title of Resistant Structures, it seems that the title of Unrepentant Renaissance refers not only to the texts which Richard reads, but to the texts which Richard produces in response to them, and finally, to Richard himself, who by being his resistant and unrepentant self has placed his students and colleagues deeply in his debt. Just as it would Milton, this makes Richard happy. Thank you very much, Richard.
I'm not at the moment going to decide whether I think de Man is more like Engels or Nozick. I have to ponder that a little bit. I have to say, it's a question that hadn't occurred to me before. And to answer the other question, yes, I certainly do think skepticism about the usefulness of worrying about anachronism does lead to skepticism about periodization, and I think that's simply true. One of the wonderful things about listening to Billy's talk and to sort of talking with Billy over the years that I've had the pleasure of doing so, not quite enough years, because he spent quite a while, as another former student who's here, Peter Canales, did, wandering in the wilds of the Committee on Social Thought before he came to the bosom of the English department. So really, I think only the second half of Billy's graduate career that I had the pleasure of participating in. But what that involved and what his talk reminds me of is that one can bring things to students that one wouldn't necessarily foreground in one's immediate self-description, but might be very important to one. So, I mean, I spent a lot of my undergraduate years doing analytic philosophy, and was sort of very tempted to go to graduate school in philosophy, and my best, also craziest, philosophy teacher was very insistent that I should go to graduate school in philosophy and carry on his work in the Quine-Davidson tradition. Well, needless to say, I ignored Fred Newman's advice and went to graduate school in English. But one of the things that I was excited about in going to graduate school at Harvard was the philosophy department, and being able to study with people like Quine and Putnam while I was studying English. I didn't meet Stanley Cavell for years. I didn't even know he was there. I was so deeply a traditional analytic philosopher. And I think that philosophy, sort of analytic philosophy, has kind of come to the fore more in my work in recent years. And it's wonderful to have a student who picks up on that, who really wants to talk about Bernard Williams and Donald Davidson, not only in themselves, because they're certainly worth talking about in themselves, but also as relevant to literary study. And one of the odd things about the relation between literary study and, let's call it theory or philosophy, is that continental philosophy of various kinds has been utterly privileged in literary study. And the fact that there's this amazingly rich and deep tradition of Anglo-American philosophy has been more or less ignored. I mean, that everyone knows Foucault and a handful of people know Bernard Williams or Donald Davidson in literary studies. So it was really wonderful to have a student who shared that interest and sort of reminded me of how important that interest is to me. So I thank you, Billy.
Our next speaker is Elizabeth Hutcheon, who got her PhD as well in 2011. She's at Huntington College now. The title of her talk is The Comedy of Romeo and Juliet, Genre and Rhetoric.
I should apologize for being the first person to speak after this session has officially ended. Where I work currently, no meeting ever... It's not your fault. Well, what I was going to say is where I work currently, no meeting ever runs late, and I'm still really confused by that. First of all, I'd like to thank Eric Rasmussen for organizing this event. I'm delighted to be here to honor such a wonderful scholar and friend. I certainly would not have made it through the dissertation process without Richard's support and guidance, and it's an honor to be celebrating him today. Before I start my discussion of Romeo and Juliet, I wanted to share an anecdote, as you do. So Richard does not actually appear in this story, but it speaks to his outsized reputation in our field. It happened at the Shakespeare Association of America annual meeting, the first I'd ever attended, which was held in Dallas, Texas. I was a newly minted ABD clutching the first chapter of my dissertation, excited to finally be participating in the world of real Shakespeare scholars. So at the opening reception, at which I knew virtually no one, see first SAA above, I was speaking with a junior faculty member whose name and institution are lost to history, who asked who my dissertation advisor was. Richard Strier, I said. Really? She replied. How's that going? Yeah, Richard doesn't know this story, actually. In a tone that reflected less awe at the fact that I kept such distinguished company and more concern for my very life. I can only assume that she had seen Richard dismantle a speaker with his trademark, let's say, enthusiastic rather than ruthless line of questioning. But there are two things that my nameless interrogator did not know about Richard Strier. One, in the context of the advisor-advisee relationship, at least in my case, Richard was never anything but supportive, even when discussing the chapter that must not be named. You guys all had one of those, right? And two, Richard's propensity for aggressive questioning comes from his total commitment to precision in language and in thought. This is what allows him to be such an astonishing close reader, and it is how he brought out the best in us, his students. I wish that I had saved my copies of his annotations of my dissertation, which towards the end he would print out, annotate, scan, and then email to me in Alabama. And I wish I'd saved them as props for this talk, but in my memory, each page is covered in pen with broad questions about my theoretical claims right alongside copy edits for comma splices. Richard taught me to think clearly, write clearly, and most importantly, to fully commit to my hopefully well thought out, clearly explained interpretation of a text. So I'd like to turn now to a place in Romeo and Juliet where precision in language actually comes up. I'm thinking of Act 3, Scene 5, the morning after scene. Here, Romeo and Juliet debate the arrival of the coming day, and I've skipped some lines for expediency. Juliet says, "Wilt thou be gone? It is not yet near day. It was the nightingale and not the lark that pierced the fearful hollow of thine ear." And Romeo says, "It was the lark, the herald of the morn, no nightingale. Look, love, what envious streaks do lace the severing clouds in yonder east." Juliet, "Yon light is not daylight, I know it I." Romeo, "I am content, so thou wilt have it so. I'll say yon gray is not the morning's eye." As you all know, Juliet opens this scene by claiming that morning has not yet come, while Romeo insists that day is breaking. Eventually, however, Romeo acquiesces to Juliet's imagined world, though not totally, as evidenced by his later come, death, and welcome. This is the last scene of dialogue between Romeo and Juliet in the play, their final moments together before the tragedy spins out of control. This scene bears a striking resemblance to another in the Shakespearean corpus, Act 4, Scene 5, of The Taming of the Shrew, in which the not yet or ever, depending on how you read it, lovers, Catherine and Petruchio, are on the road to Padua. We don't often think of these two plays in tandem. Romeo and Juliet's idealized teenage love seems to be a far cry from the troubling relationship between Catherine and Petruchio. Yet, Catherine and Petruchio also argue about whether it is day or night. Petruchio says, "Good Lord, how bright and goodly shines the moon." Catherine says, "The moon, the sun, it is not moonlight now." Petruchio, "I say it is the moon that shines so bright." Catherine, "I know it is the sun that shines so bright." In each of these pairings, one member claims that it is day while the other insists that it is night. Both Romeo and Catherine end up yielding their correct claim that it is day to their partner's insistence. Both scenes utilize the same verbs. Petruchio's, "I say it is the moon," and Romeo's, "I'll say yon gray is not the morning's eye." Catherine's, "I know it is the sun," and Juliet's, "Yon light is not daylight, I know it I." While the verbs do not map directly onto truth claims, both Catherine and Juliet know while Petruchio and Romeo say, even though Catherine and Romeo are right and Juliet and Petruchio are wrong, both scenes are playing with the distinction between knowing and saying. Importantly, the moments of yielding are described in the same terms as well. Catherine says, "Then, God be blessed, it is the blessed sun. But sun it is not when you say it is not. And the moon changes even as your mind. What you will have it named, even that it is, and so it shall be so for Catherine." Romeo says, "I'll say yon gray is not the morning's eye. 'Tis but the pale reflex of Cynthia's brow. Nor that is not the lark whose notes do beat the vaulty heaven so high above our heads. I have more care to stay than will to go. Come death and welcome, Juliet wills it so." Both Catherine and Romeo characterize themselves as yielding to the will of their partners. The will of the partners is, in these cases, more important than any kind of empirical truth. Most importantly, this submission is marked by their active participation in the rhetorical fantasies that are constructed by both Juliet and Petruchio. It is striking to find these similarities in two such different plays. The motivating problem of Romeo and Juliet, i.e. the feud between the families, is imposed on the lovers by the social structures that surround them. In The Taming of the Shrew, by contrast, the proximate problem motivating the action is the interpersonal strife between Catherine and Petruchio. This, of course, has its own social dimension. I have argued elsewhere that The Taming of the Shrew is marked by an overall interest in pedagogy that identifies Petruchio with the early modern schoolmaster who teaches Catherine to speak in socially sanctioned ways, which are both confining and liberating as they could be for schoolboys. What then might this mean for Romeo and Juliet? What does this moment of rhetorical invention, which culminates in Romeo's temporary submission, signify? All over the Shakespearean corpus, we see romantic relationships defined by rhetorical playfulness. The most complete actualization of this theme might be Much Ado About Nothing. We know, after all, that Beatrice and Benedict are destined for one another after their very first scene together, and their joking is our clue. Romeo and Juliet, as well as Catherine and Petruchio, also engage in this flirtation through rhetorical performance, most prominently in Act 1, Scene 4, where they construct the sonnet together. In all of these examples, rhetoric and rhetorical flights of fancy work to establish an interpersonal relationship, a bond between two characters. This is a very different task than what one might argue was a primary goal of early modern pedagogical theory, in which rhetorical proficiency was taught to boys to help them develop as political subjects, which of course has its own interpersonal dimension, but quite different from the romantic relationships I'm describing here. For those of you who might be a little rusty on early modern pedagogical theory, many critics argue that the Renaissance classroom operated as a space of social control. The systems of discipline and control that structured boys' learning were essential to their formation as masculine subjects. And I mean this in both senses of the term, as autonomous subjects and as persons who are subject to a monarch. The achievement of rhetorical proficiency then becomes a marker of stable political gendered identity, in theory, right? So what Shakespeare does is take this tool, rhetorical proficiency, ostensibly designed for masculine subject formation, and puts it in the mouths of his young female characters, primarily in the comedies, in the context of romantic relationships in which they have the upper hand. Indeed, the linking of language games and romance in Romeo and Juliet distinguishes it from many of Shakespeare's other tragedies. We would have to look ahead to Antony and Cleopatra, another play named for lovers, to see anything similar. Think, for example, of Hamlet's inability to engage Ophelia. In 3-1, she doesn't understand his jokes, and we know that this does not bode well for them as a couple. Juliet, who by rights should be the most marginalized character in Romeo and Juliet, as a young girl betrothed according to her father's wishes, uses language to create an identity for herself as partner or even master to Romeo, an identity that transcends her patriarchal household and world. The play is a tragedy because her rhetorical license ends in death rather than the more common resolution that we see in the comedies, where the speaking heroine is reinscribed into the patriarchal social structure of marriage. This is, of course, a highly local reading, but hints at a larger conclusion. What does pointing out the similarity between The Taming of the Shrew and Romeo and Juliet teach us? Romeo and Juliet contributes to what I would argue is Shakespeare's career-long interest in using young female characters to interrogate the values of the male-dominated humanist system under which he was trained. The problem of the speaking woman is never fully resolved in Shakespeare, and Romeo and Juliet dramatizes the most dismal version of this narrative, where Juliet's death literalizes the silencing of women that we see at the end of so many of the comedies. Yet, at the same time, Shakespeare's young women, Juliet included, appropriate a rhetorical mode that was coded as masculine and through it achieve a measure of at least temporary autonomy for themselves. Almost all of you will be familiar with Richard's desire that his students' work be polished and well-crafted, and are therefore no doubt wondering how I'm going to bring this talk to an aesthetically satisfying conclusion and integrate its end with its beginning. What do The Taming of the Shrew and Romeo and Juliet have to do with Richard Stryer's career? It's funny, when you study pedagogy, it's hard not to constantly reflect on your own practice and the practices that shaped you. Despite all its oddity, double translation, anyone? And the differences in the way we teach now with student learning outcomes, teacher evaluations, meeting the students where they are, and myriad ways to measure assessment, the core values of early modern pedagogy, rhetorical proficiency and precision in thought, have persisted. Richard exemplifies these with his love of language and his total dedication to helping his students become articulate speaking subjects in their own rights. Thank you.
Well, one of the things, it's interesting, the way continuities develop sort of spontaneously in discussions and events. So just as I was mentioning a sort of sub-theme in my own life that Billy reminded me of, Elizabeth reminds me, and one of the things that I admire most about Elizabeth is she had the courage at one point to tell me, "Don't call me Liz." which I think I'd been doing for years, thinking it was a friendly thing to do. And I really admired the fact that she spoke up, because I have to confess, in a similar situation, when a very eminent scholar who I respected called me Dick, which my parents had told me never to let anyone call me, I didn't speak up and say, don't do that. And so since, when did I first meet her? In 1975 or so, Barbara Lewalski has been calling me Dick. So I herald Elizabeth's courage so that I won't go through the next 25 years calling her Liz. But it's too, if you don't do it early, you're stuck with it. So I'm stuck with, I have one person in the world who calls me Dick, very enthusiastically. Anyhow. But the sub-theme is that, I mean, one of the things that I've had the pleasure of having as part of my life at the university is a connection to the Committee on Gender Studies. It used to be Women's Studies, became Gender Studies. I was master of the Humanities Collegiate Division when that committee started and had a little hand in getting it legitimacy. And it's something that I've always felt was important, even though my role in it has been very just peripheral in terms of giving papers here and there. But having students who are doing feminist work of a not necessarily immediately recognizable kind. The kind of work that Elizabeth was doing, that Anne talked about, is really important to me, that this is work that is utterly non-doctrinaire, but at the same time interested in holding to political values. And I think the way in which Elizabeth's work shows that what's normally thought of as an impossibly patriarchal system that's completely dominated by notions of power, namely sort of Elizabethan rhetorical theory, can be liberating for women and can be represented as such. And of course, Alicia's work goes this way as well. This event has made me realize that that's been a strand, and I'm quite happy about it. And maybe I feel that it justifies the fact of the Committee on Gender Studies keeping me on their roster all these years, even though I never go to meetings.
Our final speaker today is Adam Sebka from Stanford, and his title is Those Be Rubies, Richard Strier in the Green World.
Thank you, everyone, for staying so very late. I appreciate it. It's an honor to be here.
You should announce your new affiliation.
Oh, I'm actually at Montclair State University starting in the fall, so switching over. I'll try to be expeditious here in a way that I was not with the dissertation process. I first saw Richard really in action as a teacher in an undergraduate Shakespeare course for which I had my first job as a TA. This was new territory for me. I was new to grad school, new to teaching, and new to the different ways that a person could be a teaching scholar. This was a lecture class, which I was perfectly familiar with from college. I knew how it worked. Wisdom was imparted, softball questions fielded, softball responses deftly turned by the lecturer to open on to the next point. This first day of Richard's class made it clear that things work differently here. I saw a lot of undergrads, even here where they're so famously clever and thorny, steer their ships onto uncharted shoals, surprised, I think, at Richard's willingness to take as much time as might be needed to challenge their premises in a serious and sometimes fatal way. One of the two graduate classes that I was taking at this point, right at the beginning, involved an emphasis on crisis pedagogy, and it wasn't as if I was a delicate flower myself. I expected all kinds of rigorous questions from my teachers. But it was the first time I'd seen a professor field questions in an undergraduate lecture hall as if they were theories to be tested. This process came with a certain contemplative actio that I was to come to know all too well, in which Richard's head, with its thick frames and tufts, angles skyward, searching the ceiling or perhaps the heavens for some guidance in evaluating what is most likely a faulty idea, but also possibly a key that will unlock a marvelous new passageway in Shakespeare and early modern culture. A rare moment, but so crucial, as I learned from Richard over the years, to rejuvenating our sense of what it feels like to wonder, to doubt, and to know. It's this unparalleled fusion of skepticism and optimism that I'd like to gesture to here as an approach to a kind of intellectual version of the Shakespearean green world as Richard in part has helped to redefine it. In A Midsummer Night's Dream, there is a key test of audience belief and imagination when Puck meets a fairy at the beginning of Act 2. By way of introduction, the fairy explains, "And I serve the fairy queen to do her orbs upon the green. The cowslips tall her pensioners be. In their gold coats spots you see, those be rubies, fairy favors. In those freckles live their savors." In Shakespeare and the Skeptics, Richard writes that this passage, like the fairy world in general, quote, and I'm going to quote him for a while here, seems to be giving its audience a sort of Blakean choice. In A Vision of the Last Judgment, Richard reminds us, Blake rejects the materialism in all senses of his contemporaries, and he captures their voices. "What," it will be questioned, "when the sun rises, do you not see a round disk of fire, somewhat like a guinea? To which Blake responds, "Oh, no, no, I see an innumerable company of the heavenly host crying, 'Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty.'" You can see that, this is still Richard, you can see the guinea-like disc, or you can see the heavenly host. You can see the spots in cowslips, or you can see rubies, fairy favors. End quote. The interesting choice for Richard here, as in the rest of the play, is the skeptical one, since his guiding question in the essay is whether or not the fairies, quote, "do anything in the play that could not be accounted for otherwise." My sense of this meeting in the woods, as also being a meeting on the stage, is that we are presented with a theatrical context in which we no longer have to choose, or in which the choice would be a false one. Indeed, Richard doesn't quite choose in the essay. He's interested in, or at least acknowledges, the availability of both the spots and the rubies, and in fact, this simultaneous availability is what opens the field that the essay explores. This is the first sense in which I want to take the cowslips as a figure for something that I think Richard implicitly teaches. What is beautiful or even wondrous about scholarship is not an easy thing to account for, and indeed it may only be truly accessible through the work of rigorous skeptical thought. This may not seem like much of a revelation, especially given the talks you've all heard today, but it felt refreshing to me in the context of my first years of graduate school. For me, and for some in my cohort, there was an increasingly pressing sense that new historical approaches, which felt all-encompassing at the time, sometimes had, for all their incredible productivity, a stifling quality, a kind of late Foucauldian melancholy that could leave one feeling trapped. There were more and more moments late in my undergraduate career and early in the graduate program when I felt that the most exciting elements in scholarship somehow kept turning out to be explications of their own resigned subjection, as if paths of discovery could only be followed back around, Escher-like, to where they started. The danger was, I think, much more one of the fields sometimes being described publicly through a kind of sentimental morbidity, as it was of any real problem in methodology. I took my first seminar with Richard just after Stephen Greenblatt had given a presidential address at the MLA, in which he characterized his familiar desire to speak with the dead as, quote, "the ethos of the profession as a whole," a capstone to 20 years that began in Renaissance self-fashioning with an anecdote about a man on an airplane asking him to mouth the words, "I want to die." I hope I'm generating a sense of the ethos of early graduate school life here. I find it difficult to imagine Richard admitting this kind of thing into an argument, even peripherally. What I encountered in his seminar was entirely unlike a seance in which the dead inform us that art can release us from power by showing us how we have already submitted to it. Texts approached as a resistant structures, for me at least, opened up urgently needed breathing room, where discovery could crack the sense of inevitability, even as rigor extended far enough into the larger framework of scholarship to counter any sense of magical resignation. That's maybe just a terribly overburdened way of saying that Richard helped save me from stage 1 graduate student malaise. But this was a rescue by method as well as inspiration, and that method had to do with learning again how to look closely at what was generally right in front of me. These qualities, looking closely and looking at the surface, are both ones that the fairies' presentation in the woods oddly insist upon. One thing I love about those lines is that they are fantastically blunt. "The cowslips tall her pensioners be, in their gold coats spots you see, those be rubies, fairy favors." The straightforward language here forgoes every opportunity of transformation and enchanted revelation in favor of bald assertion. This is what you see, this is what it is. In Wittgenstein's terms via Richard, and we've heard this already today, look, don't think. Richard has returned to this idea recently in The Struggle Against Symbolism, where he finds Stanley Cavell attempting and mostly failing to read, quote, what is truly, obviously, literally there. But this is also a struggle that Richard has always remained engaged in, and again, we've heard a lot about it today. And not only in his written work. As we've all witnessed countless times, this is often what Richard brings presenters back to in workshops, on panels, and relentlessly from the audience. A return to the obvious, but only in the sense that the obvious is so often what's hardest for a whole room of strong minds to see. Looking closely at what is there. What I'd really like to thank Richard for today, I think, is teaching me how to read again, how to approach a text as a green world in which what is right in front of us can prompt us in equal measure to skepticism and to wonder. On this lovely late May evening, then, I'll close by wishing Richard an adventurous retirement in this kind of world, where there are, to call on another woodland comedy, books in the running brooks, sermons in stones, and good in everything.
Well, speaking of the obvious and the importance of recognizing the obvious, it must be obvious to everyone here that I have been blessed with extremely wonderful students. And Adam is not at all the least of them. One of the things that's interesting in sort of watching people's career is that sometimes people have breakthrough moments, like Alicia describing her discovering the women, the transgressive women in the legal archives. And then there are other people who seem to sort of always be kind of working the same path, even if they didn't know it. And Adam, it seems to me, was very much like that. I think some of our earliest conversations were about Stanley Cavell, with whom he had studied at Harvard. And I remember we had some great conversations early on about the very peculiar scene in King Lear, where Gloucester falls from his knees to his face, about 4 feet or so, and is told he's fallen this vast distance and his life's a miracle. And Adam was already, when he came here, just quite fascinated with, how does this work? Why don't we laugh? I mean, what's going on here? How can we believe this? And it was interesting that question sort of asked without much knowledge of the period, but just asked as a really deep and interesting question about dramaturgy, about drama, etc. As Adam learned more and more and more and became really a serious Renaissance scholar, that kind of question continued to interest him and still does, and really informs his dissertation, which I'm sure is going to turn into a wonderfully rich book. So I guess, well, first of all, let me just thank everybody for coming here. It's really just wonderful that you've all turned out, and I hope to continue close and warm relations with everyone in this room. And I want to, of course, thank Eric for all the work he did in putting this together. But as a final thought about sort of graduate study, I guess what I've learned and what I can sort of take from all of these wonderful, rich stories and reminiscences and talks is a sense that when the thing works, what learning means is that people find their own voice, and that it's not that of their teacher. That somehow, if the teacher is really doing his or her job, the voice that ultimately emerges from the person is the person's own. And I guess that's the note I'd like to end on. Thank you very much for coming.